good morning, or perhaps it's still night for you. Here in our little Viking fishing village, the line between night and day is often blurred. Especially in the colder months, you won't find any gentle sunrises painting the sky with soft hues here. Instead, imagine a sky the color of steel slowly, almost grudgingly, lightening. The first hint of dawn isn't a burst of light, but more like a subtle shift in the darkness. A gradual, almost imperceptible, lightening of the inky blackness. It's a slow, gray dawn that creeps in, announcing the start of another day of survival. Forget those idyllic images of a rooster crowing. Your alarm clock is a combination of the biting wind whistling through the cracks in your longhouse and the persistent, rhythmic crashing of waves against the rocky shore. You're likely sleeping on a straw-filled mattress, perhaps with a rough woolen blanket for warmth. Comfort wasn't exactly a priority back then. Think of it more as a functional sleeping arrangement, and depending on the size of your family, you might be sharing that mattress with several other people. Cozy, right? And many families did. You might also be roused by the bleating of sheep or the grunting of pigs. A truly organic alarm system, shall we say? Even as the sky begins to lighten, the inside of the longhouse remains dim. Light filters in through small, smoke-stained windows, or perhaps just a hole in the roof. It's a world of shadows and muted colors. Your bare feet hit the earthen floor, cold and unforgiving. There are no slippers waiting for you here. The floor might be covered with rushes or straw, but it won't offer much in the way of insulation. Don't expect to be reading any books by natural light. No gentle lullaby here. You're probably not bathing every day or even every week. Cleanliness was a different concept back then. Embrace the dirt. It's part of the Viking experience. You might see your mother already tending to the fire, coaxing the embers back to life. It's her job to make sure the fire never goes out, a vital task for warmth, cooking, and light if you're really lucky enough to be sharing the longhouse with livestock. Layers are key to survival in this climate, so you might also have a woolen undershirt and leg wraps. Someone needs to gather firewood, tend to the flames, and clear away the ashes. It's a continuous cycle. The fabric is rough and scratchy against your skin, and likely still damp from the previous day. Comfort is secondary to practicality. Now, let's talk about your bed. Forget your memory foam mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets. Every muscle in your body protests as you attempt to untangle yourself from the blanket and the bodies of your fellow sleepers. The cold seeps into your bones almost instantly. You can practically feel the dampness in the air. The air inside the longhouse is thick, heavy with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and whatever meal was cooked the night before. Ventilation wasn't exactly a strong suit in Viking architecture. Imagine a faint, lingering scent of fish, mingled with earthy tones and the ever-present aroma of burning wood. It's a sensory experience, to say the least. Stretching is, well, it's an experience, and then the light, or rather, the lack thereof. Once you're finally vertical, the reality of the day sets in. Time to get dressed. Your clothing is probably a simple woolen tunic and trousers. And let's not forget the ever-present grime. With the rising, you likely look around to see the other members of your family still asleep or beginning to stir. And the fire, oh, the fire. It's the heart of the longhouse, the center of family life. But it's also a source of constant work, as the fire crackles back to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Other members of the family begin to wake up. Children start to stir, their sleepy eyes adjusting to the dim light. Everyone knows what needs to be done, and there's no time to waste. Survival depends on hard work and cooperation. Your father or older brothers might already be preparing for the day's fishing trip, checking their nets and gear. There's a sense of urgency in the air. Before any real work begins, however, there's the essential task of relieving yourself. Don't expect a gourmet meal. Breakfast is likely to be a simple affair, perhaps some porridge made from oats or barley, or some stale bread. Forget indoor plumbing. Your toilet is likely an outhouse, a simple wooden structure located a short distance from the longhouse. But food is precious, and nothing is wasted. Every scrap is carefully conserved. People talking, children playing, animals stirring. It's a chaotic but comforting symphony. The day's tasks are many and varied, depending on your age, gender, and skills. Some will head out to sea to fish, braving the dangerous waters in their longboats. Others will tend to the fields, planting crops or harvesting whatever is in season. It's a harsh life, yes, but it's also a life filled with purpose, community, and a deep connection to the natural world. Still others will work on crafting and repairing tools, clothing, or buildings. This is your community, your family, your world. Survival depends on teamwork and a willingness to work hard. It's a far cry from our modern lives of comfort and convenience. It's a world of hard work, simple pleasures, and constant challenges. It's a world where survival is a daily struggle. It is also a time that, depending on what signs the gods provide, some might take this time to pray, to honor, and to respect the powers of nature and the cosmos in the winter. This is a particularly unpleasant experience. Think freezing temperatures, biting winds, and, well, let's just say it's not a spa experience. And there's no toilet paper. Instead, you might be using moss, leaves, or whatever else is readily available. Again, practicality trumps comfort. Well, let's just say it's acquired. Don't expect a lot of flavor. The emphasis is on sustenance, not culinary delight. Think bland and filling. Back inside the longhouse, you'll see your mother or another female family member beginning to prepare breakfast. If you're lucky, you might have some dried fish or cheese to add to your meal. And the taste, as you eat, the longhouse comes alive with the sounds of daily life. But there's always a thought that must go through a Viking's mind before starting his day, especially for one who lives in a fishing village. Did the gods smile down on us today? Will the weather be fair? Will the boats return safely? These questions and others must be answered by the gods of old. And so it is here where rituals and signs are checked to avoid the sea's wrath. Once breakfast is finished, it's time to get to work. Everyone has a role to play, and everyone's contribution is essential. So, there you have it, a glimpse into a typical morning in a Viking fishing village. And as the day begins, you realize that every moment is a gift, a testament to your resilience and your ability to adapt. All right, settle in, everyone. Let's really get into the nitty-gritty, the sensory overload that was Viking life. Now, forget the sanitized images of horn helmets and pristine fjords. We're diving headfirst into the sights, smells, sounds, and even the textures of a Viking fishing village. Trust me, it's a potent cocktail, and not always a pleasant one. First, let's talk about sight. What would assault your eyes the moment you stumbled into one of these settlements? Color, or rather, the of it. Imagine a landscape dominated by grays and browns. Think weathered wood of longhouses and boats. The dull gray of the North Sea stretching to the horizon. The brown of earth and mud churned by constant foot traffic. You might see the vibrant splash of dye-wool clothing, reds, blues, yellows, crafted from natural dyes. But these would be expensive and not everyone would have access to them. Most people are likely dressed in undyed wool, so think muted, natural tones, and the light, the light, or lack thereof, long winters, meant short days, and even on clear summer days, the light wasn't the bright, harsh glare we're used to. The longhouses themselves would be dim, small windows, maybe just a hole in the roof to let out smoke. Meant interiors were perpetually dusky, lit by the flickering flames of the hearth or oil lamps. Imagine trying to perform delicate tasks, like weaving or carving, in that dim light. Eye strain must have been a constant companion. Then there's the smoke, a constant haze hanging in the air, both inside and out. The smoky smell of burning wood would permeate everything, stinging your eyes and coating your lungs. It would be in your hair, your clothes, your food, inescapable. Visually, it would be a world of stark contrasts, the muted landscape punctuated by bursts of vibrant color, the dim interiors against the vast expanse of the sea. A world where the play of light and shadow was dictated by the seasons and the ever-present smoke. Now, brace yourselves, because we're moving on to smells. This is where things get interesting. Forget your modern air fresheners and sanitized. Environments. A Viking fishing village was an olfactory assault of epic proportions. Let's start with the obvious: fish. Mountains of fish, drying, rotting, being processed. The overpowering, pungent stench of decaying seafood would be everywhere. Mix that with the smell of wood smoke, acrid and biting, and you have a base layer of unpleasantness that permeates. Everything. Then add the aroma of animal dung. Humans and animals lived in close proximity. Manure was used as fertilizer, fuel, and even building material. So the earthy, ammonia-rich smell of livestock would be ever present. And let's be honest, personal hygiene wasn't exactly a high priority. Bathing was infrequent, clothing was rarely washed, so add the distinct aroma of unwashed bodies to the mix, a symphony of bow and stale sweat. Tanning hides was another smelly process, soaking animal skins in urine and various other concoctions to soften and preserve them. That would create a powerful, unforgettable stench. And finally, the latrines, open pits or rudimentary outhouses overflowing with human waste. You can imagine the stench that would emanate from those on a warm day. It would be a complex, layered aroma, a cocktail of fish, smoke, dung, sweat, and decay. Your nose would be constantly bombarded with unpleasant odors. You get used to it, eventually. But that first woof, it's enough to knock you off your feet. Next up, let's talk sounds. It wasn't all peace and quiet by the fjords. A Viking fishing village was a noisy place. The ever-present sound of the sea, the crashing of waves against the shore, the creaking of boats in the harbor, the cries of seagulls circling overhead. The ocean was a constant presence, a reminder of both the bounty and the danger that surrounded them. The sounds of daily labor, the rhythmic thud of axes splitting wood, the hammering of nails building boats and houses, the scraping of knives cleaning fish, the grinding of grain preparing flour. All these sounds would blend together into a constant hum of activity. The voices of the villagers, shouting instructions, bartering for goods, telling stories, singing songs. Norse language can be quite guttural, too, adding to the general cacophony. The sounds of animals, the bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, the cackling of chickens, the barking of dogs. Livestock were an integral part of the village, and their noises would be woven into the soundscape. And, of course, the weather. The howling of the wind, the crashing of thunder during storms, the patter of rain on the thatched roofs of the longhouses. The elements were a constant force, shaping the lives and the sounds of the village. Finally, let's touch on textures. What would things feel like in a Viking fishing village? Roughness. The rough texture of homespun wool clothing, the splintery wood of the longhouses, the coarse fibers of ropes and nets. Smooth surfaces were a rarity, coldness and dampness, the chill of the North Sea wind, the dampness of the earth underfoot, the clammy feel of fish scales on your hands. Staying dry and warm would be a constant battle. ***, the stickiness of fish. Guts. Cleaning fish was a messy business, and the slimy, sticky texture of fish guts would be something you get very familiar with very quickly. The hardness of tools, the weight and the unforgiving feel of an axe in your hand, the cold steel of a knife against your skin. These tools were essential for survival, but they were also demanding and unforgiving. The softness of animal furs, sheepskins, bearskins, sealskins, these would provide warmth and comfort, but also carried their own distinct smell and texture, rough, cold, damp, sticky, and hard. The textures of a Viking fishing village would be a constant reminder of the harshness of their environment. So, there you have it, a sensory snapshot of Viking life. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, it was gritty and rough and often and pleasant, and it was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the people who managed to thrive in such a challenging environment. Now, really think about it. Could you handle it? Alright, settle in folks, because this is where things get real. You think you'd be enjoying leisurely strolls down cobblestone streets, admiring the quaint architecture of a Viking fishing village. Think again before the sun even thinks about peeking over the horizon. Life in a Viking village is already in full swing, and it's anything but relaxing. We're talking about a relentless cycle of back-breaking labor, a never-ending to-do list that would make your modern-day task. Manage your weep. Forget hitting the snooze button. Your body is your alarm clock, and the consequences of ignoring it are, well, let's just say you wouldn't want to find out. So, let's dive headfirst into the daily grind, shall we? And trust me, you'll quickly appreciate your electric kettle and indoor plumbing just a little bit more. First up, water. Water. That seemingly simple, readily available resource we take completely for granted. In a Viking village, it's a precious commodity that requires serious effort to obtain. No turning on the tap here, folks. Imagine lugging heavy buckets, plural, from the nearest stream, well, or maybe even that slightly questionable, algae-ridden pond down the way, multiple times a day. And these aren't your dainty, modern plastic buckets. We're talking hefty, wooden or leather containers filled to the brim. Straining your back and testing your grip with every step. Think that's a what-time chore? No, this is a constant requirement. Water is needed for everything: drinking, cooking, washing, and let's be honest, bathing probably wasn't a daily occurrence. But even that required a significant amount of H2O. So, yeah, water fetching alone could easily consume a significant chunk of your morning, leaving you with aching muscles and a profound respect for the simple luxury of running water. Next on the agenda, firewood. Now, unless you're planning on eating raw fish and shivering through the perpetually damp Nordic nights, you're going to need a fire. And fires, as you may know, require fuel. That means chopping wood. Lots and lots of wood. Forget your fancy electric chainsaw. We're talking axes and a whole lot of elbow grease. Picture yourself hacking away at stubborn logs, the cold biting at your exposed skin, your muscles screaming in protest with each swing. And remember, you can't just grab any old branch. You need dry, seasoned wood, which means finding it, hauling it back to the village, and then splitting it into manageable pieces. This is an everyday task, folks, and it's not just for cooking. Fire is essential for warmth, for light, and for certain crafting activities. So, get ready to channel your inner lumberjack, because your survival depends on it. Speaking of warmth, let's talk about the hearth. In the center of your home, the hearth is the heart of everything. It must be constantly stoked, cleaned, and tended. Keeping a fire burning continuously, even overnight, was crucial for maintaining a semblance of comfort and avoiding the Herculean task of relighting it from scratch every morning. Think of it as a needy, demanding pet that requires constant attention. You'd be scooping out ash, adding fuel, adjusting the airflow, all before you've even had a chance to properly wake up. Neglect your hearth, and you risk a cold, dark, and very unpleasant day. But wait, there's more. All that fire produces, ash, and ash, unfortunately, doesn't magically disappear. It needs to be dealt with. Scooping out the ashes from the hearth was a daily chore, and disposing of them was another delightful task. You wouldn't just toss it out the door. Ash had potential uses in cleaning, in dyeing cloth, even in some rudimentary forms of fertilizer. Deciding how to use it, and then transporting it where it needed to go, added another layer to the pre-dawn workload. Okay, so we've got water, firewood, and ash sorted. What's next? Oh, right, waste disposal. Let's not sugarcoat this, folks. Viking villages weren't exactly known for their pristine sanitation. Human waste, animal waste, food scraps, it all needed to go somewhere. And some were usually meant a designated area outside the village. A place that was likely overflowing with, well, you can imagine, this wasn't a pleasant job. It involved lugging buckets or containers of organic matter to this designated disposal site, trying not to breathe too deeply, and hoping you didn't encounter any overly aggressive flies. And let's not even think about the smell. It's a task that would test even the most hardened constitution, and it was a necessary part of maintaining a relatively hygienic living environment. Asterisk, and speaking of animals, livestock. Many Viking families would have kept animals, chickens, goats, pigs, for eggs, milk, meat, and other essential resources. And those animals, bless their furry or feathered little hearts, required care. Feeding them, watering them, mucking out their stalls or pens, this was a daily obligation, often falling to the children, but still requiring significant time and effort. And remember, these weren't pampered pets, these were working animals, essential to the village's survival, and their well-being was directly tied to your own. Then there's the matter of food preparation. Before you can even think about eating, you need to prepare the food. That might involve grinding grain, slaughtering an animal, or cleaning and gutting fish. These were time-consuming and physically demanding tasks that required specialized skills and tools. Forget popping a frozen pizza in the oven. This was a hands-on, from-scratch process that could easily consume a significant portion of your morning. So, let's recap. Before the sun even rises, you've already hauled water, chopped wood, tended the hearth, disposed of waste, cared for livestock, and started preparing food. And that's just a basic overview, depending on your role in the village. You might also be involved in other pre-dawn chores, such as preparing fishing nets, tending to a forge, or assisting with childbirth. And all of this, my friends, is done with limited light, often in the frigid cold of the Nordic morning. You're battling the elements, battling fatigue, and battling the constant awareness that your survival depends on your ability to persevere. Think you'd still enjoy that Viking fishing village? The reality of Viking life was a constant struggle against the elements. Modern life has insulated us from these basic, fundamental struggles. We have running water, central heating, and pre-packaged food at our fingertips. We can order almost anything we need online and have it delivered to our door within hours. The Vikings had none of that. They relied on their own strength, their own ingenuity, and their own community to survive. I think we've established that chores before dawn were relentless. But the difficulty wasn't just physical, it was mental. Imagine waking up every single day knowing that you face the same exhausting routine, day in, day out, with little variation and minimal comfort. It takes a certain kind of mental fortitude to endure that kind of grind, and it's a fortitude that many of us, accustomed to our comfortable and convenient lives, simply don't possess. The Vikings did. They were hardened people. So, the next time you reach for that cup of coffee, remember the Viking villager, hauling water in the pre-dawn chill, and maybe, just maybe, you'll appreciate that modern convenience a little bit more, and consider, could you really handle even one day of their never-ending to-do list? I wonder. I really do. Asterisk all right, settle in, everyone. Let's talk about breakfast, or, more accurately, what Vikings considered breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I won't sugarcoat it. You might want to keep a snack handy, because this section might not exactly whet your appetite. We're diving deep into the Viking diet, and trust me, it's a far cry from a modern-day Michelin star meal. Forget perfectly plated avocado toast, or even a simple bowl of cereal. The Viking diet was, shall we say, rustic. It was dictated by geography, climate, and the very real limitations of food preservation. Imagine trying to feed an entire village without refrigeration, without canning, without, well, most of the things we take for granted today. So, what did these seafaring warriors actually eat? Let's start with the basics. Grains were a staple, particularly barley, oats, and rye. These were used to make bread, porridge, and even ale, a crucial part of the Viking experience. Now, this wasn't your fluffy, artisan bread. Think dense, coarse, and often a bit hard. Imagine something closer to a dense rye cracker. And you're getting closer. These grains were ground using hand-turned quern stones, a task that was probably about as fun as it sounds. Meat was definitely on the menu, but it wasn't an everyday occurrence for most Vikings. Wealthier families, chieftains, and warriors likely had more access to meat, but for the average villager, it was more of a special occasion thing. When meat was available, it could be beef, pork, mutton, or even goat. And let's not forget the occasional wild game, like deer or boar, if they were lucky enough to hunt successfully. Of course, being a fishing village, fish and seafood were incredibly important: cod, herring, Salmon and various shellfish were dietary staples. They knew how to use what they had. This is where the fishing element from our title comes into play. Dairy products were also a significant part of the Viking diet. Think milk, cheese, butter, and skyr, a thick, yogurt-like dairy product that's still popular in Iceland today. These provided essential fats and proteins crucial for survival in a cold climate. Skyr, especially, was a valuable food source, as it could be preserved for longer periods. Now, let's talk about vegetables. This is where things get interesting. Viking agriculture was limited, and their diet wasn't exactly overflowing with leafy greens. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were common, as were beans and peas. But forget about a colorful salad. Vegetables were more likely to be boiled into stews or used to thicken soups. Fruits were even rarer. Berries like blueberries, cranberries, and raspberries were gathered when in season, providing some much-needed vitamins. Apples were also cultivated in some areas, but they were likely small and tart compared to the varieties we enjoy today. Okay, so we have grains, meat, sometimes fish, dairy, and a few vegetables and fruits. Sounds okay, right? Well, the real challenge wasn't just what they ate, but how they preserved it. Remember, no refrigerators. This is where things get a bit less appealing. One of the most common methods was drying. Meat and fish were hung out to dry in the wind and sun. This created a tough, leathery product that could last for months if properly stored. Think of it as Viking jerky. Definitely a workout for your jaw. Salting was another popular preservation technique. Meat and fish were packed in salt, which drew out moisture and inhibited bacterial growth. This created a heavily salted product that needed to be soaked in water before cooking to remove some of the excess salt. Smoking was also used, especially for fish. The smoke helped to dry the fish and imparted a distinctive smoky flavor, which, honestly, probably helped mask any less desirable aromas that might have developed during the preservation process. Pickling was used for vegetables. They would use vinegar to help keep things preserved. They would also do a fermentation process that could preserve their food. Dairy products were often preserved by turning them into cheese or skyr, which, as mentioned, could last for a surprisingly long time. Butter was sometimes preserved by burying it in bogs, which, surprisingly, could keep it relatively fresh for months, although I can't imagine the flavor was exactly delightful. Now, let's be honest, none of these preservation methods exactly resulted in gourmet cuisine. Dry meat could be tough and flavorless, salted fish could be incredibly salty, and smoked fish, well, let's just say it probably smelled like a campfire long after it was cooked. The Viking diet was also heavily influenced by seasonal availability. In the summer months, when food was more plentiful, Vikings could enjoy fresh fish, berries, and vegetables. But in the long, dark winter months, they relied heavily on preserved foods, which, by that point, were probably, well, let's just say they weren't exactly bursting with flavor or nutrients. Imagine eating mostly dried, salted, and smoked foods for months on end. It probably wasn't a culinary paradise. And let's not forget the ever-present risk of spoilage. If food wasn't properly preserved, it could become contaminated with bacteria, leading to illness or even death. Food poisoning was a very real threat in Viking times. So, what did a typical Viking meal actually look like? Well, it varied depending on the time of year and the family's social status. But here's a rough idea. Breakfast might consist of a bowl of porridge made from barley or oats, perhaps with some milk or skyr. Maybe, if they were lucky, a bit of dried fruit or some leftover fish. Lunch might be a piece of bread with some cheese or salted meat. Again, pretty basic. Dinner was usually the main meal of the day. It might be a stew made with meat, vegetables, and whatever else was available. Fish was often boiled or grilled, or perhaps made into a fish stew. Bread and ale were common accompaniments. And that's it. Pretty simple, pretty repetitive, and definitely not for the faint of heart. So, the next time you're enjoying a perfectly cooked steak or a fresh salad, take a moment to appreciate the abundance and variety of food that we have today, and spare A thought for the Vikings, who faced a constant struggle to find enough food to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment. Their diet might not have been glamorous, but it was what sustained them through long voyages, fierce battles, and the challenges of everyday life. And in the end, that's what really matters. Next, we'll be moving on to what exactly they would wear to survive. Don't go anywhere. Asterisk, let's talk about what you'd be wearing if you suddenly found yourself smack dab in the middle of a Viking fishing village. Forget your Gore-Tex and breathable synthetics. We're talking about surviving the elements with wool, linen, and maybe some animal hides. It's a far cry from modern outdoor gear, and let me tell you, it wouldn't be a walk in the park, or a sail on a calm fjord for that matter. First, let's start with the basics, the underlayers. These are crucial because, well, you're probably not showering every day. Vikings weren't exactly known for their fastidious hygiene, although they were likely cleaner than popular imagination suggests, but still, you want something between you and that scratchy wool. Linen was the go-to fabric for undergarments. Think of it as the Viking version of your moisture-wicking base layer, except it's not quite as effective. Linen is made from flax fibers. It's relatively comfortable, and it absorbs sweat pretty well. However, it also takes a while to dry, which can be a problem in damp climates. Imagine being out on a fishing boat, soaked by sea spray, and then having to wait hours for your linen undertunic to dry. Chilling thoughts indeed. Quite literally, men typically wore a linen undertunic, reaching about mid-thigh, sort of like a long t-shirt. And, underwear. Well, evidence is a bit scarce on that one. Some theories suggest they were linen drawers or braids, which are basically loose-fitting shorts. Others, not so much. Let's just say ventilation was probably ample. For women, the linen undertunic would be longer, often reaching the ankles. Now, onto the main event, the wool. This is your primary defense against the cold, wind, and rain. Vikings were masters of working with wool. It was readily available, relatively easy to process, and provided excellent insulation, even when wet. Think of wool as nature's Gore-Tex, only not quite as waterproof and a lot heavier. Men generally wore a woolen tunic over their linen undertunic. This would be a heavier, thicker layer, providing significant warmth. The length could vary, but usually fell somewhere between mid-thigh and the knee. These tunics would often be dyed with natural pigments, creating a range of colors, from earthy browns and greens to more vibrant blues and reds if you were wealthy enough. Remember, vibrant dyes were expensive, so the brighter your clothes, the more status you had. On top of the tunic, men might wear woolen trousers or leggings, held up with a belt or tied at the waist. These could be either loose-fitting or more tightly fitted, depending on the region and personal preference. Again, practicality was key. You needed to be able to move freely while working, whether you were hauling nets, rowing a boat, or, raiding a monastery. Women's woolen clothing was similar in principle, but often longer and more elaborate. They typically wore a woolen overdress, sometimes called an apron dress or a hangrick, over their linen undertunic. This overdress was often held up by two oval brooches, called tortoise brooches or oval buckles, which fastened the straps to the front of the garment. These brooches were often highly decorated and served as a display of wealth and status. Beneath the overdress, women might wear a woolen underdress for extra warmth, especially in colder climates. And just like the men, they would often wear woolen leggings or stockings for added protection. Now, let's talk about outerwear, because believe me, you need it. For fishermen, a woolen cloak or cape was essential. This would be a large piece of fabric, often rectangular or semicircular, that could be draped over the shoulders and fastened with a brooch or a simple tie. The cloak provided an extra layer of insulation and protection from the wind and rain. Some cloaks might even be treated with animal fat or beeswax to make them more water resistant, although this wouldn't make them fully waterproof, more like water-resistant-ish. In particularly harsh weather, Vikings might wear hooded cloaks or coats, providing even greater protection from the elements. These hoods could be pulled up to shield the face from the wind and rain, and the coats would often be longer, reaching down to the knees or even the ankles. And now, for the feet. Forget your hiking boots or waterproof trail runners. Viking footwear was all about leather. And, well, it wasn't always pretty. The most common type of footwear was a simple leather shoe or boot, constructed from a single piece of leather that was sewn together around the foot. These shoes were typically ankle-high and provided basic protection from the ground. For added warmth, Vikings might stuff their shoes with straw, hay, or wool. This would provide extra insulation and cushioning, and help to absorb moisture. Think of it as the Viking version of wool socks, except considerably less comfortable. In colder climates, they might wear higher boots, reaching up to the calf or even the knee. These boots would provide greater protection from the snow and ice, and help to keep the feet warm and dry. Again, these would be made from leather, and often lined with fur for added insulation. Now, here's the thing about leather footwear in wet conditions. It's not ideal. Leather absorbs water, which makes it heavy and stiff. Wet leather also loses its insulating properties, which means your feet will get cold very quickly. And if you're constantly walking around in wet leather shoes, you're practically guaranteed to develop blisters and other foot problems. So, while leather shoes were essential for protection, they had their limitations. Imagine spending hours on a fishing boat in soaking wet leather boots, your feet freezing and blistered. Not exactly a recipe for a pleasant day. Hats were also a must-have, especially in colder climates. The most common type of headwear was the simple woolen cap, which could be pulled down to cover the ears and neck. For added warmth, some caps might be lined with fur or padded with wool. In particularly harsh weather, Vikings might wear hooded hats or even fur hats, providing maximum protection from the cold. These hats would often be made from the skins of animals like sheep, goats, or even seals. And, of course, no Viking outfit would be complete without a belt. Belts were essential for holding up trousers, attaching tools, and displaying status. They were typically made from leather and fastened with a buckle. Belts could be simple and functional, or highly decorated with metal fittings and elaborate designs. Now, let's talk about the limitations of Viking clothing. As effective as it was for its time, it was far from perfect. The biggest limitation was its lack of water resistance. Wool provides good insulation even when wet, but it's not waterproof. And while some clothing might be treated with animal fat or beeswax, this only provided limited protection from the rain. Another limitation was its bulkiness. Woolen clothing can be heavy and cumbersome, especially when wet. This could make it difficult to move freely, which would be a problem when you're trying to haul nets, row a boat, or climb around on a ship. And, of course, there's the issue of comfort. Wool can be itchy and scratchy, especially if it's not properly processed. And linen, while more comfortable, takes a long time to dry. So, imagine spending your days in damp, scratchy clothing, constantly battling the elements. Not exactly a luxurious experience. So, there you have it, a brief overview of Viking clothing and footwear. It was practical, functional, and well-suited to the harsh environment in which they lived, but it was far from perfect. It lacked water resistance, it was bulky and uncomfortable, and it required a lot of maintenance. So, next time you're out enjoying the great outdoors in your modern, high-tech gear, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come, because trust me, you wouldn't last a day in a Viking fishing village wearing only what they had. It was a tough life, and their clothing was just one small part of the challenge. All right, settle in, friends. Let's delve into the watery world of the Viking fisherman. Now, before you picture a bunch of burly guys hacking at fish with axes, let's get a little more realistic. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for these folks, it was survival. And it was a whole lot more complicated and dangerous than you might think. So, pull up a metaphorical seat, and let's cast off. First things first, let's talk boats. You can't catch fish without a boat, right? And Viking boats weren't your average dinghies. They were meticulously crafted vessels, often clinker built. Now, Clinker built means the planks overlapped each other, kind of like scales on a fish, only, well, made of wood. This construction made the boats incredibly strong and flexible, able to withstand the brutal waves of the North Atlantic. Think of it like this: a modern yacht might be sleek and fast, but a Viking longship was built to take a beating and keep on floating. And that flexibility was key. A rigid boat would simply crack under the strain of those waves. The materials they used were crucial, too. Oak was the go-to choice for the hull, prized for its strength and resistance to rot. Pine and ash might be used for other parts, like the oars and masts, and these weren't just any planks. They were carefully selected and seasoned, a process that could take years. Imagine waiting years for your lumber to be ready just to build a boat. That's dedication. Now, shipbuilding wasn't a solo effort. It was a community project. Skilled shipwrights led the construction, but everyone pitched in, from felling trees to caulking the seams with tar and animal hair. This was a skill passed down through generations, with closely guarded secrets and techniques. Imagine the pressure. Messing up could mean the difference between a successful fishing season or a watery grave. And these weren't just pretty boats, they were surprisingly advanced for their time. They were designed to be both seaworthy and maneuverable, able to navigate shallow waters and withstand strong winds. They used a single square sail, which was simple but effective, and long oars for rowing when the wind wasn't cooperating or when they needed to sneak up on some unsuspecting fish. And speaking of winds, they didn't have weather forecasts, so they had to know the winds, the seas, and the stars. All right, boat covered. Now, let's talk about the actual fishing. No fancy rods and reels here, folks. Viking fishermen relied on a combination of skill, knowledge, and pretty basic tools. One of the most common methods was line fishing. They used hand lines made from twisted plant fibers or animal gut, with hooks fashioned from bone, antler, or metal if they were lucky. Bait could be anything from worms and insects to small pieces of fish. Imagine sitting in a small, open boat, hand line in the water, battling the waves and the cold, hoping for a bite. Not exactly a relaxing day at the lake, is it? Another technique was net fishing. They used nets made from woven plant fibers or, again, animal gut, weighted down with stones and kept afloat with wooden floats. These nets could be set from the shore or deployed from boats, and then hauled in by hand. Think about the sheer physical effort involved in pulling in a net full of fish, especially in rough seas. And then there was spearfishing, which required incredible skill and accuracy. They would use long spears with barbed heads to target fish in shallow waters or along the coast. This was probably more common for catching smaller fish or eels, but still, you had to be pretty darn good to consistently hit a moving target with a spear from a rocking boat. The fish they caught were essential to their survival. Cod was a staple, providing a reliable source of protein. Herring was another important catch, often preserved by salting or smoking to last through the winter months. And they also caught other species like haddock, ling, and even the occasional whale or seal, which provided not only meat but also valuable blubber for oil and fat. But this wasn't a well-stocked supermarket. Fishing was unpredictable. Some days they'd haul in a bounty that would feed the village for weeks. Other days, they'd come back empty-handed. And those empty-handed days could mean the difference between survival and starvation, especially during the long winter months. Now, let's talk about the dangers, because, let's be honest, Viking fishing wasn't exactly a walk in the park. The North Atlantic is a notoriously unforgiving place, with unpredictable weather, treacherous currents, and the ever-present threat of storms. Imagine being caught in a sudden squall. The waves crashing over the sides of your small boat, the wind howling in your ears, struggling to keep afloat while battling the elements. One wrong move, and you're overboard, facing hypothermia and a very real risk of drowning. And they couldn't just call the Coast Guard, and it wasn't just the weather they had to worry about. Navigation was a constant challenge. They didn't have GPS or fancy charts. They relied on their knowledge of the stars, the coastline, and the behavior of the sea. Getting lost at sea could mean drifting for days, running out of supplies, and eventually succumbing to the elements. And then there were the sea monsters. Okay, maybe not literal sea monsters, but the ocean was full of very real dangers. Whales could capsize small boats, and sharks, while not as common in those waters as they are today, were still a threat. And let's not forget the simple, but deadly, dangers of the gear itself. A rogue hook could become embedded, a line could constrict an arm, and a slip on deck could knock someone unconscious. Furthermore, let's talk about the cold. The waters of the North Atlantic are icy. Even in the summer, prolonged exposure to the cold could lead to hypothermia, frostbite, and a whole host of other health problems. Imagine spending hours in a small, open boat, drenched in seawater, battling the cold and the wind, trying to stay focused on the task at hand. And this wasn't just an occasional thing. It was a daily reality for Viking fishermen. On top of all the dangers, Viking fishermen faced another challenge: the sheer monotony of the work. Fishing involved long hours of repetitive tasks, often in uncomfortable conditions. Imagine spending hours hauling lines, mending nets, or rowing against the wind. With little to break the monotony, it took a certain kind of person to endure that kind of lifestyle, someone with a strong work ethic, a tolerance for discomfort, and a deep connection to the sea. So, the next time you're enjoying a delicious piece of fish, take a moment to think about the Viking fishermen who risked their lives to bring that food to the table. They were tough, resourceful, and incredibly skilled, and their survival depended on their ability to navigate the dangers of the sea and bring home the daily catch. It's safe to say that most of us wouldn't last very long trying to do what they did every day. But the fisherman's life wasn't just about braving the elements and pulling in the catch. It was about understanding the rhythms of the sea, the habits of the fish, and the interconnectedness of the natural world. It was about respecting the power of the ocean and acknowledging the dependence on its bounty. And it was about passing down knowledge and skills to future generations, ensuring the survival of the community. And it was a communal effort, too. This wasn't a lone wolf kind of profession. These villages lived and died on the ability of their fishermen to pull in the catch. So they supported one another, and they knew how to celebrate their victories. So, there you have it, a little glimpse into the challenging and often dangerous life of a Viking fisherman. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was essential to the survival of their communities, and it required a level of skill, resilience, and courage that most of us can only imagine. All right, settle in, friends. Let's drift away to the cold, unforgiving waters that define a Viking's life. You know, the Vikings weren't just raiding and pillaging, they were fishermen first and foremost. And that meant braving the elements in ways that would make even a seasoned sailor shudder. And believe me, the North Atlantic doesn't pull any punches. Imagine you're crammed into a longship, maybe not one of those super fancy dragon-headed ones, but a sturdy, clinker-built vessel nonetheless. The wind's picking up, the waves are starting to slap against the hull, and that familiar knot of dread is forming in your stomach, because out here, the weather can turn on a dime. The sagas are full of tales of shipwrecks and storms, each one a chilling reminder of the ocean's power. We read about fleets scattered to the winds, ships dashed against rocky coasts, and entire crews lost to the icy depths. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were a constant threat, a grim reality woven into the fabric of Viking life. Think about the limitations of Viking navigation. No GPS, no weather forecasts, just the sun, the stars, and a deep understanding of the currents and tides. But even the most skilled navigator can be caught off guard by a sudden squall or a rogue wave. And then there's the sheer physical challenge of battling a storm in a Viking ship. These vessels were remarkably seaworthy for their time, but they were still small, open boats, vulnerable to the elements. Imagine the relentless rain, the biting wind, the constant spray of salt water in your face. You're soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably and trying desperately to hold onto the oars as the ship pitches and rolls. The Vikings understood the power of the sea implicitly. They knew that it could provide sustenance and wealth, but it could also take everything away in an instant. They respected it, feared it, and developed a unique set of skills and beliefs to cope with its unpredictable nature. One of the biggest dangers was the sudden onset of storms. Picture this: you're out fishing, the weather's calm, the sea is relatively smooth. Suddenly, the sky darkens, the wind whips up, and the waves begin to swell. Before you know it, you're in the middle of a full-blown gale. These storms could be incredibly violent, with winds reaching hurricane force and waves towering over the ship. The Vikings didn't have sophisticated weather forecasting, so they had to rely on their instincts and their knowledge of the sea to anticipate these changes. They would look for telltale signs in the clouds, the wind direction, and the behavior of the seabirds. If a storm was imminent, the priority was to get back to shore as quickly as possible. But that wasn't always an option. Sometimes, the storm would hit too fast, or the coastline would be too far away. In those cases, the Vikings had to batten down the hatches, literally, and ride out the storm. This meant securing everything on board, lowering the sail, and bailing water constantly to prevent the ship from swamping. It was a grueling, exhausting ordeal that could last for hours, even days. The Vikings would have to work together, relying on their strength, their skill, and their unwavering determination to survive. And even if they managed to weather the storm, the danger wasn't over. Ships could be damaged, sails could be torn, and oars could be lost. Navigation became even more difficult, and the risk of running aground on a rocky coast increased significantly. Shipwrecks were a common occurrence in Viking times. The waters around Scandinavia are treacherous, with rocky coastlines, strong currents, and unpredictable weather. Many ships were lost due to storms, navigational errors, or simply bad luck. When a ship went down, the chances of survival were slim. The water was cold, the currents were strong, and there was little hope of rescue. Those who managed to reach shore faced a new set of challenges. They might be stranded on a remote island far from any settlement, with no food, no shelter, and no way to signal for help. The sagas are filled with accounts of shipwrecked Vikings struggling to survive in these conditions. They would have to scavenge for food, build shelters from whatever materials they could find, and try to make their way back to civilization. It was a test of their resilience, their resourcefulness, and their will to live, even those who survived. A shipwreck could be traumatized by the experience, the memory of the storm, the fear of drowning, the loss of their comrades. These were all things that could haunt them for the rest of their lives. The constant threat of storms and shipwrecks had a profound impact on Viking culture. It shaped their beliefs, their rituals, and their social structures. They developed a deep respect for the sea and a strong sense of community, knowing that their survival depended on their ability to work together and support each other. They also turned to their gods for protection, offering sacrifices and prayers to appease the sea gods and ensure safe passage. The Vikings believed that the sea was ruled by powerful deities such as Aegir and Ran, who could either help them or hinder them, depending on their mood. Stories of maritime disasters served as cautionary tales, reminding everyone of the sea's potential for destruction. These stories were passed down through generations, reinforcing the importance of caution, skill, and respect for the ocean. So, the next time you're enjoying a peaceful day by the sea, take a moment to remember the Viking fishermen who braved these same waters in open boats, facing the constant threat of storms and shipwrecks. It's a reminder of the courage, the resilience, and the deep connection that humans have always had with the ocean. And honestly, it makes a comfortable, modern life seem a whole lot more appealing, doesn't it? All right, settle in, friends, because this section, well, it might make you a little queasy, but it's important to understand just how rough things were. We're diving into Viking first aid at sea, and let me tell you, there wasn't a whole lot of coddling going on. Imagine you're on a fishing boat, days from shore, battling rough seas. Accidents happen, right? A rogue wave throws you against the mast, a hook tears through your hand. Or maybe you even get tangled in a fishing line and pulled overboard. In our modern world, we'd be calling for a helicopter. But what did the Vikings do? Well, Forget antiseptic wipes and butterfly bandages. Viking first aid was all about practicality, often bordering on the brutal. Their primary goal: stop the bleeding, prevent infection if they could, and get you back to work. Sentimentality didn't really factor in. Let's start with cuts and gashes. A minor scrape might get a quick rinse with seawater. And let's be honest, that seawater wasn't exactly pristine. Remember, they're surrounded by fish, seaweed, and whatever else might be floating around. For deeper cuts, the approach was a little more direct. First, they tried to clean the wound, again likely with seawater. Maybe even urine if nothing else was available. Sounds gross, right? But urine does contain ammonia, which can have some antiseptic properties, though I certainly wouldn't recommend it today. Then came the tricky part: closing the wound. If it was small enough, they might just bind it tightly with a clean cloth. But for larger gashes, they had a few options, none of them particularly pleasant. One method was stitching, and surprisingly, they did have needles. These were usually made of bone or antler, and thread made from animal sinew. Now, I'm not talking about a sterile surgical environment here. These needles and thread were likely reused, and definitely weren't being sterilized between patients. Imagine the bacteria. Another, even more alarming method was cauterization. That's right, they would use a hot iron to sear the wound closed. The idea was to stop the bleeding and hopefully kill some of the bacteria. Can you imagine the pain? No anesthesia, just pure, searing agony. And while it would stop the bleeding, it also caused significant tissue damage and scarring. Think about the smell. That's going to linger with you. Then there was the herbal remedy approach. Vikings had some knowledge of medicinal plants, though their understanding was often mixed with superstition. They might apply poultices made from things like yarrow, known for its blood-clotting properties, or honey, which does have some antibacterial effects. But again, these poultices weren't exactly sterile, and the effectiveness probably varied wildly. It's a real toss. Up. Now, let's talk about broken bones. Imagine you're tossed around in a storm and break your arm, sending a bone on a rocking longship in the middle of the ocean. Nightmare fuel. The first step was usually to try and realign the bone as best they could. Again, no painkillers. Just grit your teeth and bear it. Then, they create a splint using wood, bark, or even hardened leather. This would be bound tightly to the limb with cloth or rope. The problem was, without x-rays, they couldn't really know if the bone was properly aligned. So, you could end up with a limb that healed crookedly, leaving you with permanent pain and limited mobility. You were lucky if it healed at all. If not, it's a permanent handicap. Dislocations were another common injury. Imagine your shoulder popping out of its socket during a particularly violent wave. The Viking solution: brute force. They'd often try to pop the joint back into place by pulling and twisting the limb. Again, excruciatingly painful, and with a high risk of further damaging the surrounding tissues. It worked on occasion, though. And what about infections? This was the real killer. Even if you survived the initial injury, infection could quickly set in, turning a minor wound into a life-threatening situation. Vikings didn't understand the concept of bacteria or germs, so they had no real way to prevent infection. They might try to clean wounds with seawater or apply herbal poultices, but often it was a losing battle if an infection did set in. They might try to lance the boil and drain the pus, again, using whatever tools were available, and without any real understanding of hygiene. They might try to use vinegar or strong alcohol to cleanse the wound, but often it was too little, too late. Imagine the smell, imagine the throbbing pain. Amputation was sometimes the only option for severe infections. If a limb became gangrenous, they would have to cut it off to save the person's life. This was a last resort and a truly terrifying prospect. The procedure would be performed with an axe or a saw, and again, without anesthesia. They tried to cauterize the stump with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. The survival rate for amputation was incredibly low, not only from pain or blood loss, but secondary infection of the new stump. And then there was the psychological impact of all this living with chronic pain, dealing with disfigurement, and witnessing these brutal procedures firsthand must have taken a tremendous toll on their mental health. There wasn't exactly therapy on the high seas. Consider this, the Vikings, while tough, also likely relied on a bit of folk medicine and what we might call old wives' tales. Some of these might have had a grain of truth to them, while others were probably completely useless or even harmful. For example, they might have believed that certain charms or incantations could ward off infection, or that specific stones possessed healing properties. These beliefs, while not scientifically valid, could have provided some comfort and hope in a desperate situation. Whether that really mattered at the end of the day is up for debate. Also, think about the role of leadership. The captain, or a particularly experienced crew member, would likely be the one making decisions about medical treatment. These decisions would be based on their knowledge, experience, and the available resources. Some people might simply have a knack for it and would be deferred to. And what about pain management? Besides alcohol, which they definitely had plenty of, there wasn't much they could do. Perhaps some herbal remedies with sedative properties, but mostly it was about enduring the pain and hoping for the best. So, the next time you complain about a little seasickness, just imagine facing a Viking-style amputation on a rocking longship. In the middle of a storm, suddenly, that nausea doesn't seem so bad, right? It's important to note that it wasn't all bad. The Vikings were incredibly resourceful and capable. The problem is many of these methods would not have worked and often caused harm. Let's not forget that these seafarers existed in a very different reality than ours. We can barely imagine it. Next time, we'll delve deeper into the community support system that sustained these people and how they were much more than just savage fishermen. Okay, friends, let's settle in and take a deep breath. We're going to delve into another crucial aspect of surviving in a Viking fishing village, a look at community support, specifically the absolutely vital roles that women and children played. It's easy to picture Viking men as these fearsome warriors sailing off in their longboats, but the reality of Viking life was far more nuanced, and the survival of the village depended just as much on those who stayed behind. Let's be clear. A Viking fishing village wasn't just a pit stop for warriors. It was a complex, interconnected community, and everyone had a role to play. It's time to think about the contributions of the other half, often overlooked in the sagas but crucial to the village's existence and, truthfully, the fishing efforts themselves. Viking women, far from being passive figures, were the backbone of the community. While the men were out at sea, often for days or weeks at a time, the women were responsible for maintaining the home, raising the children, and managing the village's resources. This wasn't some easy domesticity either, mind you. It was a constant grind of hard work and responsibility. Think of it, someone had to ensure the survival of their family unit. That someone was almost always the woman of the house. One of the most critical roles women played was in agriculture. While fishing was vital, it wasn't always reliable. Storms, poor catches, or simply the time of year could leave the village short on food. Women were responsible for cultivating small plots of land, growing crops like barley, oats, and vegetables. This wasn't some leisurely garden tending. It was back-breaking labor using primitive tools. They had to clear the land, plant the seeds, weed the crops, and harvest the bounty, all while contending with the unpredictable Scandinavian climate. And, of course, they had to protect those crops from animals. Think about that on top of everything else. Beyond agriculture, women were also responsible for tending livestock. This could include cows, goats, sheep, and pigs, providing the village with milk, meat, and wool. They had to feed and water the animals, clean their stalls, and protect them from predators. They also had to process the raw materials, turning milk into cheese and butter, wool into yarn and cloth. It's a lot to think about, all the spinning and weaving involved. And these were vital skills for creating clothing and textiles for the entire family. And then there was the food processing and preservation. Imagine bringing home a huge catch of fish. What do you do with it all? Well, The women of the village were the experts in preserving food for the long winter months. They smoked fish and meat, salted it, dried it, and fermented it. They also preserved fruits and vegetables through pickling and drying. These methods were essential for ensuring that the village had enough food to survive the lean times. But let's circle back to fishing specifically. Women's contributions weren't just on land. While men did most of the actual catching, women provided crucial support. They were often responsible for preparing the fishing nets, repairing them when they were damaged, and even helping to design and improve them. Imagine untangling a huge fishing net with frozen fingers day in and day out. The fibers of the net biting into your hands constantly. It isn't fun, and it takes patience. It took knowledge. Without well-maintained nets, the men couldn't fish effectively, so this was a vital, if often unseen, contribution. Furthermore, it's pretty well agreed upon that women were involved in processing the catch. After the fishermen came back, gutting, cleaning, and preparing the fish for preservation was laborious, time-consuming work. Again, a crucial step in surviving. They also played a vital role in trading the surplus. Women often managed the sale or barter of surplus goods, including fish, textiles, and agricultural products. This required negotiation skills, knowledge of the market, and the ability to manage finances. They were, in effect, the village's merchants, ensuring that the community had access to essential resources. The role of Viking women extended beyond the purely practical. They were also responsible for maintaining the social fabric of the community. They organized social gatherings, celebrated festivals, and passed down traditions and stories. They were the keepers of the village's history and culture, ensuring that it was passed on to future generations. And let's not forget the truly obvious: women bore and raised the children. This wasn't just about providing basic care. They were responsible for teaching children the skills they would need to survive and thrive in the Viking world. They taught them how to farm, how to fish, how to weave, how to build, and how to fight if necessary. They instilled in them the values of courage, loyalty, and perseverance. This job alone easily qualifies them as heroes of their societies. Now, let's turn our attention to the children of the village. While they might not have been as strong or experienced as the adults, they were still expected to contribute to the community's well-being. From a young age, children were given chores to do, helping with tasks around the home and in the fields. They might help with gathering firewood, fetching water, tending animals, or weeding crops. It really was all hands on deck. Older children would take on more responsibility, helping with fishing, hunting, or crafting. They would learn the skills they would need to become productive members of the community. Boys might learn how to build boats, how to sail, how to fight, while girls might learn how to weave, how to cook, and how to heal. Children also played a role in supporting the village's economy. They might help with gathering resources, such as berries, nuts, and herbs. They might also help with trading, carrying goods to market, or running errands for merchants. While we don't want to overly romanticize childhood in this era, kids did get the chance to just be kids, too. Things like playing games, telling stories, and just exploring the world around them were absolutely critical to their development as people and members of the Viking community. And perhaps most importantly, children helped to care for the elderly and the sick. They might read to them, feed them, or simply keep them company. This was a way of showing respect for their elders and ensuring that they were not forgotten or neglected. Viking culture was deeply respectful of its elders. Wisdom was cherished in those communities, as it should be. It's important to emphasize that the division of labor in a Viking fishing village wasn't always rigid. There was a lot of overlap between the roles of men, women, and children. In times of crisis, everyone had to pitch in and do whatever was necessary to survive. We can only imagine, right? For example, if the village was attacked, women and children might take up arms to defend their homes. They might also help to care for the wounded and bury the dead. Or think about this, if there weren't enough men to crew a ship, women might take to the oars and help sail it. We do have descriptions of these kinds of things from the era, so we know that, in a very real sense, the lines were blurred when survival was on the line. What does this all mean for our modern-day individual trying to survive in a Viking fishing village? Well, it means that you can't just focus on the heroic image of the Viking warrior. You need to understand the importance of community, the value of hard work, and the crucial roles that everyone plays in ensuring the survival of the group. A modern person dropped into a Viking fishing village would need to learn quickly to adapt to this reality. You need to be willing to work hard, to cooperate with others, and to contribute to the community's well-being, regardless of your gender or age. The modern notions of highly specialized skills and careers go right out the window. The Viking fishing village was a tough place to live, but it was also a place of incredible resilience and strength. The people who lived there were able to survive and thrive because they worked together, supported each other, and understood the importance of community. They were resourceful and adapted in order to survive. If you want to try and last a day in that environment, you better get ready. To do the same, you have to be ready to do whatever needs to be done and learn fast. Next time, we'll talk about what happens after the fish are caught. Stay tuned, friends. All right then. Let's gather round the metaphorical hearth, shall we? Because after hauling in a boatload of fish, the work definitely wasn't over. In fact, in many ways, the real challenge was just beginning. See, in a Viking fishing village, you couldn't just pop down to the local supermarket for a fresh cod fillet. Everything had to be preserved, or it would spoil faster than you can say Odin's beard. And believe me, they didn't have refrigerators back then, or even ice for the matter. So, how did these hardy seafarers ensure their hard-earned catch lasted through the long winter months, or fueled their voyages far from home? The answer, my friends, lies in a variety of time-honored preservation techniques, each with its own quirks and intricacies. We're talking about methods that were refined over generations, passed down through families like treasured heirlooms, and these methods weren't just about extending shelf life. They were about survival, about ensuring the entire community had enough to eat when the seas turned treacherous, and the fishing boats couldn't venture out. Let's start with what was probably the most common and widely used method, salting. Now, salting, in its simplest form, is exactly what it sounds like, covering the fish or other seafood in salt. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. The Vikings weren't just sprinkling a little table salt on their herring. No. They were using coarse sea salt, often gathered from evaporated seawater along the coastline. This salt would draw out the moisture from the fish, creating a less hospitable environment for bacteria, which, as you know, is the prime culprit behind spoilage. The process itself could vary. Sometimes they gut and clean the fish, then pack them in barrels with alternating layers of salt. Other times, they'd split the fish open, rub salt into every nook and cranny, and then lay them out to dry in the sun and wind. The drying process further reduced moisture content, making the fish even less likely to spoil. Now, don't picture these fish laid out all neatly like some modern operation. This was a Viking village. Everything was kind of haphazard and organic. Picture lines of fish flapping in the wind, like metallic sails, under the watchful eyes of the village children chewing away opportunistic birds, now salted fish. While effective, wasn't exactly a gourmet delicacy. It was intensely salty, of course, and quite dry. But it was edible, nutritious, and, most importantly, it lasted a long time. To make it more palatable, Vikings would often soak the salted fish in fresh water before cooking it, drawing out some of the excess salt. It could then be boiled, fried, or added to stews and soups, providing a valuable source of protein during lean times. Think of it as the Viking equivalent of canned goods, not the most exciting meal, but a reliable source of sustenance when you really needed it. Next up, we have smoking, another extremely popular method of preservation, and one that also imparted a distinct flavor to the fish. Smoking involved exposing the fish to smoke from a wood fire, which not only helped to dry it out but also deposited antimicrobial compounds on its surface, inhibiting bacterial growth. The type of wood used for smoking could also influence the final flavor of the fish, oak. for instance, might impart a strong, smoky flavor, while alder might offer a more subtle, sweeter taste. The smoking process could be done in a variety of ways. Some villages would have dedicated smokehouses, small, enclosed structures with a fire pit at the bottom and racks or hooks for hanging the fish above. The fire would be kept smoldering, producing a steady stream of smoke that would slowly cure the fish over a period of days, or even weeks. Others might simply hang the fish in the rafters of their homes, allowing them to be smoked by them. Smoke from the cooking fire. Imagine that. Everything in your home perpetually smelled like smoked fish. Again, like salted fish. Smoked fish wasn't exactly a culinary masterpiece, but it was a valuable source of food. It could be eaten as is, or added to stews, soups, or other dishes. The smoky flavor also helped to mask any lingering fishiness, making it more appealing to some palates. Plus, smoked fish tended to be less salty than salted fish, which was a definite bonus for those who weren't particularly fond of intense saltiness. But it wasn't all just about fish, you know? While fish was the mainstay of the Viking diet, they also preserved other seafood, like shellfish. And even when they could get their hands on it, marine mammals like seals or even whales. Shellfish could be dried or smoked, while larger marine mammals were often rendered for their blubber, which could then be used for cooking, lighting, or even waterproofing. Imagine the smell of that. Now, let's not forget about the other methods. Not as common but still useful. Pickling, for example, involved preserving food in a brine or vinegar solution. While not as widely used for fish as salting or smoking, pickling could be used to preserve smaller fish or shellfish. The acidity of the brine or vinegar would inhibit bacterial growth, extending the shelf life of the food. Then there was drying, which, as we've already touched upon, was often used in conjunction with salting or smoking. But drying alone could also be effective, particularly in climates with low humidity. Fish, meat, or even seaweed could be hung out to dry in the sun and wind, reducing their moisture content and making them less susceptible to spoilage. Think jerky. But Viking dot, and finally, there was fermentation, a process that involved using beneficial bacteria to preserve food, while perhaps more commonly used for dairy products or vegetables. Fermentation could also be used to preserve fish. A classic example is the Swedish delicacy surströmming, fermented herring, which, let's just say, is an acquired taste. The Vikings may have had a similar, albeit less extreme, version of fermented fish, using naturally occurring bacteria to create a tangy, preserved product. So, there you have it, a glimpse into the fascinating world of Viking food preservation. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was absolutely essential for survival. And while we might have refrigerators and freezers today, it's worth remembering the ingenuity and resourcefulness of these ancient seafarers, who managed to thrive in a challenging environment, relying on nothing but their knowledge, their skills, and a whole lot of salt and smoke. And now, let's move on, shall we? The Vikings didn't just fish and preserve, they needed other ways to keep the community going. Alright then, let's dive into how our Viking fishing village keeps the wolf from the door. So to speak, I mean, you can only eat so much fish, right? And even if you could survive solely on a diet of cod and herring, you quickly realize that you need, well, everything else: tools, weapons, building materials, fancy clothes, the list goes on. Our resourceful Vikings had two primary methods of obtaining these necessities: trade and, of course, raiding. Now, when we think of Vikings, images of bloodthirsty warriors immediately spring to mind. And admittedly, that image isn't entirely inaccurate, but raiding wasn't always the first resort. It was more like a supplementary income stream, shall we say? Trading was actually a pretty vital part of the Viking economy. It provided a more stable, if less exciting, way to acquire goods. Think of it like this: your village has a surplus of dried fish. What do you do with it? You don't just let it rot, right? You load it onto a sturdy little boat and sail off to a neighboring settlement, or even a larger trading center, and exchange it for something you do need. Maybe you trade for grain if your own harvests were poor that year. Or perhaps you need iron ore to make new tools and weapons. Salt was always a valuable commodity. Remember, preserving food was crucial, and salt was the king of preservation. These trading voyages weren't always simple affairs, though. Imagine navigating the treacherous coastal waters in a longship, battling unpredictable weather, and dealing with, let's just say, colorful characters at the trading posts. You have to be shrewd, quick-witted, and maybe even a little bit intimidating to get a good deal. After all, you didn't want to get cheated out of your precious dry fish. And what did Vikings trade besides fish? Well, it depended on the region. In Scandinavia, they had access to valuable resources like furs, timber, and iron. These were highly sought after by other cultures. They also traded things like walrus ivory, which was used to make intricate carvings, and even slaves, who were unfortunately a common commodity in many parts of the world at that time. The Vikings were incredibly skilled shipbuilders and navigators, which allowed them to travel far and wide in search of trading opportunities. They established trade routes that stretched from the British Isles in Western Europe all the way to the Byzantine Empire and even the Middle East. These weren't just casual trips either. They set up permanent trading posts and settlements in key locations like Dublin in Ireland and Hedeby in Denmark, which became bustling centers of commerce. Now, let's talk about raiding. This is the part everyone loves to hear about, right? The Vikings swooping in, axes swinging, and plundering everything in sight. Well, again, there's a little more to it than just mindless violence. Raiding was, in many ways, an economic activity, a way to acquire wealth and resources quickly and efficiently. Think of it as hostile acquisition. Why raid instead of trade? Well, sometimes trading just wasn't an option. Maybe a neighboring kingdom refused to trade with you, or maybe they had something you desperately needed, and they weren't willing to part with it willingly. Or, let's be honest, maybe it was just quicker and easier to take it than to negotiate for it. Raiding provided a way to circumvent these obstacles and get what you needed, even if it meant resorting to violence. But raiding wasn't just about acquiring loot. It was also about demonstrating power and dominance. A successful raid could enhance a Viking chieftain's reputation, attract more followers, and solidify their position within the community. It was a way to show the world that you were not to be trifled with. And who did the Vikings raid? Well, pretty much anyone who had something they wanted. Coastal settlements in England, Ireland, and France were prime targets, especially wealthy. Monasteries and churches, which were often poorly defended and full of valuable treasures. They also raided inland cities, sometimes traveling up rivers to reach their targets. These raids could be brutal affairs, and there's no point in sugarcoating that. Vikings were skilled warriors, and they weren't afraid to use violence to achieve their goals. They targeted not only the wealthy elite, but also ordinary people, plundering their homes, stealing their livestock, and taking them as slaves. It was a harsh and unforgiving world, and the Vikings were very much a product of their time. However, even raiding had its own set of rules and customs. It wasn't just a free-for-all. Vikings often targeted specific individuals or groups, and they had a code of honor that dictated how they should behave during a raid. For example, they might offer a settlement the chance to surrender and pay a ransom rather than face a full-scale attack, and they generally avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Unless, of course, resistance was met. The spoils of a successful raid were carefully divided among the participants, with the chieftain usually receiving the largest share. This wealth could then be used to fund further expeditions, reward loyal followers, and improve the village's infrastructure. It was a way of reinvesting in the community and ensuring its continued prosperity. Now, it's important to remember that trade and raiding weren't mutually exclusive activities. They were often intertwined. A Viking ship might set out on a trading voyage, but if the opportunity arose to raid a nearby settlement, they wouldn't necessarily pass it up. Conversely, a raiding party might also engage in some opportunistic trading along the way, selling off some of their plunder for other goods. It was all part of the Viking entrepreneurial spirit, I suppose you could say. And, of course, the line between trade and raiding could sometimes be blurred. What started as a peaceful trading encounter could quickly turn violent if one party felt cheated or disrespected. The Vikings were known for their volatile tempers, and a perceived insult could easily escalate into a full-blown brawl. So, how did trade and raiding actually supplement the village economy? Well, they provided access to resources that weren't available locally. Things like precious metals, spices, textiles, and weapons could all be acquired through these activities. This influx of wealth and resources allowed the village to grow and prosper, attracting new settlers and expanding its influence in the region. Moreover, trade and raiding fostered a sense of adventure and exploration. Viking voyages took them to far-flung lands, exposing them to new cultures, ideas, and technologies. This exposure broadened their horizons and made them more adaptable and resourceful. Of course, there were also downsides to this reliance on trade and raiding. It could lead to conflict with other groups, both Viking and non-Viking. It also created a society that was heavily militarized and dependent on violence. And it perpetuated a system of inequality where some individuals and groups benefited disproportionately from the spoils of conquest. But ultimately, trade and raiding were essential components of the Viking economy. They provided the means for survival and prosperity in a harsh and unforgiving world. They shaped Viking society, culture, and identity, and they left a lasting legacy that continues to fascinate and intrigue us to this day. So, the next time you picture a Viking, don't just imagine them as a bloodthirsty warrior. Think of them as a shrewd trader, a skilled navigator, and a resourceful entrepreneur, always looking for new opportunities to expand their horizons and improve their lot in life. Because, in reality, they were all those things and more. And now, shall we sail on and learn about more essential Viking skills? All right, folks, gather round. Settle in, because we're about to dive into something absolutely crucial for any Viking fishing village: crafting and building. I know. It might not sound as exciting as raiding or exploring, but trust me, these skills were the backbone of their entire existence. Without them, those longboats wouldn't sail, those houses wouldn't stand, and well, let's just say those fish wouldn't be getting caught. Think about it. Living in a harsh environment like Scandinavia, you couldn't just pop down to the local hardware store for lumber or call a plumber. When your roof leaked, everything, and I mean everything, had to be made by hand using the resources available. Around them, that's where the skills of woodworking, blacksmithing, and shipbuilding came in. Let's start with woodworking. This was probably the most versatile and widely practiced craft in any Viking village. Wood was everywhere. It was used for houses, furniture, tools, weapons, even dishes and utensils. Pretty much anything that wasn't metal was made of wood. Now, Viking woodworking wasn't just about chopping down trees. It was a highly skilled craft that required knowledge of different types of wood, understanding how to work with the grain, and a whole lot of patience. Different woods were used for different purposes. Oak, for example, was strong and durable, making it ideal for shipbuilding and structural supports. Ash was flexible and resilient, perfect for tool handles and weapon shafts. Birch was lightweight and easy to carve, used for smaller items like bowls and spoons. Imagine the skill involved in felling a massive oak tree with just an axe. It was back-breaking work, but it was essential for survival. Once the tree was down, it had to be split into planks using wedges and mallets. This was a slow and meticulous process, ensuring that the wood split along the grain to maximize its strength. Then came the shaping and carving. Viking woodworkers used a variety of tools, including axes, adzes, draw knives, and chisels to create intricate designs and functional objects. Think about the detailed carvings on the prows of their longboats, the elaborate decorations on their furniture, or the simple elegance of a wooden bowl. Each piece was a testament to their skill and artistry. Woodworking also played a vital role in constructing the houses in the village. Viking homes were typically built using a post-stand beam construction method, with large wooden posts supporting the roof and walls. The spaces between the posts were filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks, mud, clay, and straw. This provided insulation and protection from the elements. Building a house was a community effort, with everyone pitching in to raise the posts, weave the wattle, and apply the daub. It was a time for socializing, sharing stories, and strengthening bonds within the village. Now, let's move on to blacksmithing. While woodworking was about shaping and manipulating organic materials, blacksmithing was about forging and transforming metal. Iron was the most important metal in Viking society, used for everything from tools and weapons to nails and hinges. But obtaining iron wasn't easy. It had to be extracted from bog ore, a type of iron-rich soil found in wetlands. This involved a process called smelting, where the ore was heated to high temperatures in a furnace to separate the iron from the impurities. Smelting was a complex and demanding task, requiring constant attention and a steady supply of fuel. It was often performed by specialized blacksmiths who possessed the knowledge and skills to manage the process effectively. Once the iron was extracted, it could be forged into a variety of objects. Viking blacksmiths used a forge, hammer, anvil, and a variety of other tools to shape the metal. They heated the iron until it was red hot, then hammered it into the desired form. Blacksmithing wasn't just about brute force, it required a deep understanding of the properties of metal, knowing how it would respond to heat and pressure. It also required a keen eye for detail and a steady hand. Think about the tools that Vikings relied on every day: axes for felling trees, knives for cutting and carving, sickles for harvesting crops, and fishing hooks for catching fish. All of these tools were made by blacksmiths, of course. Blacksmiths were also responsible for crafting weapons. Swords, axes, spears, and shields were all essential for defense and raiding. Viking warriors relied on their blacksmiths to provide them with strong, reliable weapons that could withstand the rigors of combat. The blacksmith held a respected position in the village. Their skills were essential for survival, and they were often seen as having a special connection to the gods, particularly Thor, the god of thunder and lightning. Finally, let's talk about shipbuilding. This was perhaps the most complex and specialized craft in Viking society. The longboat was the key to their success as traders, explorers, and warriors. Without their ships, the Vikings wouldn't have been able to travel across the seas, trade with other cultures, or launch their raids. Building a longboat was a massive undertaking, requiring the combined skills of woodworkers, blacksmiths, and other craftsmen. The process began with selecting the right trees. Oak was the preferred wood for the hull, providing strength and durability. Once the trees were felled and split into planks, they had to be carefully shaped and fitted together. Viking shipbuilders used a clinker-built construction method, where the planks overlapped each other and were fastened together with iron rivets. This created a strong, flexible hull that could withstand the stresses of sailing in rough seas. The ribs of the ship were then added to provide additional support. The mast was typically made of a single, tall tree trunk, carefully selected for its straightness and strength. The sail was made of wool, woven by the women of the village. Building a longboat was a long and arduous process, often taking months or even years to complete. It required a significant investment of resources and manpower, but the result was a vessel that was both beautiful and functional, capable of carrying warriors, cargo, and even livestock across vast distances. The shipwrights, or shipbuilders, held a position of great authority in the village. They possessed specialized knowledge of shipbuilding techniques, and their skills were highly valued. They were responsible for overseeing the entire construction process, ensuring that the ship was built to the highest standards. Viking ships weren't just functional vessels. They were also works of art. The prows were often decorated with intricate carvings of dragons or other mythical creatures. The sails were sometimes dyed in bright colors. These decorations weren't just for show. They were believed to have magical properties, protecting the ship and its crew from harm. Crafting and building skills weren't just about making things, they were about problem solving, innovation, and resilience. They were about working together as a community to overcome challenges and create a better life. These skills fostered creativity and ingenuity. They were constantly experimenting with new techniques and designs, always striving to improve their craft. And, of course, there's the legacy. The craftsmanship evident in Viking artifacts continues to amaze us today, from the intricate carvings on their longboats to the finely wrought ironwork of their weapons. Their artistry and skill shine through centuries later. So, next time you see a Viking ship in a museum or a documentary, take a moment to appreciate the incredible skills and knowledge that went into its creation. Remember the woodworkers, the blacksmiths, and the shipwrights who made it all possible, because without them, the Viking Age simply wouldn't have happened. It's humbling to think that these skills, passed down through generations, were the foundation of their society. It really makes you appreciate the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the Vikings, doesn't it? All right, folks, settle in, because we're diving into a side of Viking life that might surprise you. How they handled disagreements. We're not just talking about axe fights and berserker rages here, although, fair warning, those did happen. But Viking society actually had surprisingly complex ways of resolving conflicts, ways that involve law, negotiation, and, well, sometimes, still axes. So, imagine you're a Viking, right? You live in a small village. Maybe a few longhouses huddled together. Your neighbor, Bjorn, accidentally lets his sheep wander into your barley field. Your entire crop is ruined. Now, what do? Do you immediately grab your sword and challenge him to a duel? Well, maybe, but hopefully you'd explore other options first. The Vikings had a legal system. Though it looked nothing like our modern courts, it was based on customs, traditions, and a strong emphasis on community involvement. Their laws weren't written down, not at first anyway. They were memorized and passed down orally, meaning knowledge of the law was incredibly important, and those who knew it wielded a lot of power. These laws varied somewhat from region to region. What was acceptable in Norway might be frowned upon in Sweden, and vice versa. But there were some core principles that were pretty universal across the Viking world. Things like personal honor, family responsibility, and the importance of maintaining the peace. When a dispute arose, the first step was usually negotiation. You, the aggrieved farmer, would probably sit down with Bjorn, the sheep-owning offender, and try to work things out. This might involve relatives, friends, or other respected members of the community acting as mediators. The goal was to reach a settlement that was fair to both sides and prevented the conflict from escalating. Think of it as Viking-style mediation. You present your case, Bjorn would present his, and the mediators would try to find common ground. Maybe Bjorn would offer to compensate you for the lost barley. Maybe he'd promise to keep a closer eye on his sheep in the future. The important thing was to find a solution that everyone could live with. But what if negotiation failed? What if Bjorn refused to admit fault or offered a settlement that you considered totally inadequate? That's where things got a bit more interesting. The Vikings had a concept called the Thing, which was essentially a local assembly or parliament. These things were held regularly, usually at a designated meeting place, and were attended by free men of the community. The Thing served many purposes. It was a place to make laws, discuss important issues, and, crucially, resolve disputes. When a conflict couldn't be resolved through negotiation, it would be brought before the Thing. Both parties would present their case to the assembled men, who would then act as judges or jurors. They'd listen to the evidence, hear arguments from both sides, and then render a verdict. Now, this wasn't like a modern courtroom. There were no lawyers, no formal rules of evidence. Instead, the emphasis was on personal testimony, oaths, and character witnesses. Your reputation mattered a lot. If you were known as an honest and trustworthy person, your word carried more weight. Oaths were incredibly important. Vikings believed that swearing a false oath would bring down the wrath of the gods. So people took them very seriously. To strengthen their case, they might swear an oath of innocence, or call upon witnesses to swear oaths supporting their claims. These witnesses were often family members, friends, or neighbors who could vouch for their character or the events in question. The thing also had the power to impose punishments. On those found guilty of wrongdoing, these punishments could range from fines to banishment, or even death, depending on the severity of the offense. Fines were a common way of compensating victims for their losses, and they were often calculated based on the value of the property damaged, or the severity of the injury inflicted. Banishment was a particularly harsh punishment, as it meant being ostracized from the community and forced to live as an outcast. This was especially difficult in Viking society, where survival often depended on the support and cooperation of others. Death, of course, was the ultimate penalty, reserved for the most serious crimes like murder, treason, or repeated offenses. But even with the thing in place, there were still times when disputes couldn't be resolved peacefully. Sometimes the passions ran too high, the accusations were too serious, or the parties involved simply refused to back down. In those cases, the Vikings had one last resort, the holmgang. The holmgang was a formal duel, fought according to a set of strict rules. It was a way of settling disputes through combat, a trial by ordeal where the gods were believed to favor the righteous. It's probably what you imagine when you think about Viking conflict resolution, but it was really more of a last resort. The rules of the holmgang varied somewhat depending on the time and place, but there were some common elements. The duel would usually take place on a designated dueling ground, often a small island or a marked-off area on land. Both parties would be armed with swords and shields, and they would fight until one of them was killed, disabled, or yielded. There were often witnesses present to ensure that the rules were followed and to prevent cheating. The duel would typically begin with a formal exchange of insults or challenges, and then the fighting would commence. The goal was not just to win, but to do so with honor and skill. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like a recipe for chaos, and you'd be right to some extent. The holmgang could be brutal and unpredictable, but it also served an important social function. It was a way of letting off steam, resolving tensions, and reaffirming the importance of personal honor. It's important to remember that Viking society was a warrior culture. Skill in combat was highly valued, and the ability to defend oneself was essential for survival. The holmgang provided a way for individuals to prove their courage and skill, and to settle disputes in a way that was consistent with their values. Of course, the holmgang wasn't always fair or just. The stronger, more skilled fighter had a clear advantage, and there was always the risk of accidental death or injury. But it was a part of Viking life, and it played a role in shaping their society and their culture. So, next time you picture Vikings, don't just imagine them raiding and pillaging. Remember that they also had laws, assemblies, and a system for resolving conflicts that, while sometimes violent, was also surprisingly sophisticated. It's a reminder that even in the most seemingly barbaric societies, there's often more to the story than meets the eye, and it probably makes you appreciate your modern legal system just a little bit more. Right now, let's drift off to sleep, imagining we're mediating a sheep dispute, hopefully without any actual swordplay. Sweet dreams. Friends, let's talk about hygiene, something we take pretty much for granted these days. Hot showers, readily available soap, clean water. It's also easy. But imagine trying to stay clean in a Viking fishing village. Deep breath, yeah, not so relaxing. Is it? Forget your modern squeaky clean standards. We're talking about a world of dirt, sweat, fish guts, and, well, let's just say limited plumbing. Viking hygiene, or the lack thereof, is a fascinating and, frankly, pretty grim topic. Now, let's get one thing straight. The popular image of Vikings as unwashed barbarians isn't entirely fair. They weren't trying to be disgusting. It's just that the challenges of staying clean were immense, and their understanding of germ theory was, shall we say, a little underdeveloped. Resources were scarce, time was precious, and priorities were different. When you're spending your days battling the elements and hauling in the catch, a luxurious bath isn't exactly top of the agenda. Water, first and foremost, was a precious commodity. Fetching it was a laborious chore. Imagine lugging buckets of water from a well or stream, potentially quite a distance, just for basic cleaning. And let's face it, that water wasn't exactly pristine to begin with. Think of it as naturally flavored. So, bathing in the modern sense was a rare luxury. But, and this is an important but, Vikings did value cleanliness, at least in some ways. Archaeological evidence suggests that combs, tweezers, and ear spoons were common personal items. They clearly cared about grooming, even if full-body washing wasn't a daily occurrence. Combs, especially, are found in Viking graves, suggesting they were seen as important personal possessions. These weren't just any old combs, either. They were often beautifully crafted from bone, antler, or even ivory. This suggests a certain level of attention to detail and a desire to look presentable. So, how did they keep themselves somewhat fresh? Well, partial washing was probably the most common approach. Think of it as a sort of Viking sponge bath, wiping down with a damp cloth, focusing on the face. Hands and other exposed areas would have been a regular practice. This probably offered some relief from the grime and sweat of daily life. Saunas or sweat lodges also played a role, especially in Scandinavia. These were heated enclosures where people could sweat out impurities. The process involved heating stones and throwing water on them to create steam. After sweating profusely, they'd often beat themselves with birch branches to stimulate circulation. Sounds invigorating, doesn't it? Though probably not as relaxing as a modern spa day. Then there'd be the cold plunge after. Bet that'd wake you up. Clothing also played a role, albeit a limited one. Vikings wore layers of wool and linen, which helped to absorb sweat and dirt. However, washing these garments was another challenge. Soap was made from animal fats and ash, and the process was time-consuming. So, clothing was probably washed infrequently, which, you can imagine, contributed to the overall aroma of a Viking village. And speaking of aroma, let's not forget the, shall we say, natural deodorants. Vikings likely used herbs and oils to mask body odor. Things like thyme, lavender, and other fragrant plants would have been rubbed onto the skin or incorporated into clothing. It probably didn't completely eliminate the smell, but it likely made it more bearable. Think of it as Viking febres. Dental hygiene, another area where modern standards fall short. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist. Instead, Vikings likely used chew sticks, small twigs with frayed ends that they used to clean their teeth. Evidence also suggests they used abrasive powders made from things like crushed bone or charcoal to help scrub away plaque. Effective? Probably not entirely, but it's better than nothing. And then there's the issue of waste disposal. Let's be blunt, Viking villages weren't known for their sophisticated sanitation systems. Latrines, if they existed at all, were often basic pits located on the outskirts of the settlement. Waste would have been disposed of in these pits or simply dumped in nearby fields or waterways. You can imagine the potential for contamination and the impact on public health. Personal grooming items like combs, tweezers, and ear scoops were common grave goods in Viking burials. They provide tangible evidence of a concern for maintaining at least some level of personal hygiene. The detail and artistry found in many of these pieces also suggests that grooming was seen as a worthwhile endeavor, perhaps even a status symbol. Disease, of course, was a constant threat. With limited hygiene and sanitation, infections spread easily. Skin infections, parasites, and gastrointestinal illnesses were probably rampant. And without modern medicine, treatment options were limited. The challenges of maintaining cleanliness extended beyond personal hygiene to the village as a whole. Keeping living spaces clean was a constant battle against dirt, dust, and animal waste. Floors were typically earthen, covered with straw or rushes, which absorbed spills and attracted pests. Regular sweeping and cleaning would have been necessary, but it's doubtful they were able to keep things truly sanitary. Food preparation also posed hygiene challenges. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, cross-contamination was a constant risk, and the lack of clean water made it difficult to properly wash utensils and surfaces. It's a wonder they didn't all get sick more often. So, what can we conclude about Viking hygiene? Well, it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. They faced immense challenges in maintaining cleanliness, and their practices were far from perfect by modern standards. But they weren't completely oblivious to the importance of hygiene. They valued grooming, used available resources to wash and clean themselves, and likely employed herbs and oils to mask body odor. It was a constant struggle against the elements, and they did the best they could with what they had. It also highlights the importance of our modern sanitation systems and hygiene practices. We take clean water, soap, and waste disposal for granted, but these things have a huge impact on our health and well-being. Imagine living in a world without them. It's enough to make you appreciate that hot shower a little bit more, isn't it? And while we might not find Viking hygiene practices particularly appealing, it's important to remember that they were living in a different world with different priorities. They were tough, resourceful, and resilient people who managed to thrive in a harsh environment. And maybe, just maybe, they didn't smell that bad. Well, probably did, actually. But let's give them some credit for trying, shall we? Now if you'll excuse me, I am off to take a shower. Good evening, friends. Settle in, make yourselves comfortable, and let's gently delve into a somewhat unsettling aspect of Viking life, the ever-present specter of disease and illness. Now, imagine yourself not just in a Viking fishing village, but living there. You've already got the back-breaking chores, the questionable sanitation, and the constant threat of drowning to contend with. But lurking in the shadows is something even more insidious, the unseen enemy of sickness. In our modern world, we often take access to medical care for granted. Aches, pains, sniffles, coughs. We've got pills, potions, and highly trained professionals ready to get us back on our feet. But for the Vikings, well, things were a little different. Let's be clear. Viking hygiene wasn't exactly stellar. While they did value cleanliness to a certain degree, archaeological evidence suggests they used combs, razors, and even rudimentary ear scoops. Their understanding of germ theory was, shall we say, somewhat lacking. Bathing was likely infrequent in the close quarters in their homes, particularly during the long winter months, created a perfect breeding ground for all sorts of nasties. So, what were the common ailments plaguing these seafaring folk? Well, think about it. Living in a damp, cold climate, respiratory illnesses were almost certainly rampant. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and even simple colds could quickly turn deadly, especially for the very young or the elderly. And remember those smoky longhouses? Breathing in all that smoke day in and day out couldn't have done their lungs any favors. Then there were the waterborne diseases. Fresh water sources could easily become contaminated with sewage and animal waste. This meant that illnesses like dysentery, typhoid fever, and other gastrointestinal infections were a constant threat. Imagine the misery and the potential for dehydration that these conditions would cause, especially in a world without readily available clean water or electrolyte solutions. Injuries were another major concern, and let's not forget those fishing expeditions. Cuts, scrapes, and broken bones were all part of the job, but without proper antiseptics or antibiotics, even a minor wound could quickly become infected. Imagine a simple cut turning into a festering, pus-filled sore. The Vikings likely used whatever they had on hand, herbs, honey, even animal dung, to try and treat these infections. And while some of these remedies might have had some limited effectiveness, they were often more likely to do harm than good. And then there were the parasites. Living in close proximity to animals and with less than ideal sanitation practices meant that Vikings were likely plagued by all sorts of internal and external parasites. Worms, fleas, lice. Just thinking about it makes you itch, doesn't it? So, how did the Vikings deal with all these health challenges? Well, their medical knowledge was a mix of practical experience, herbal remedies, and a healthy dose of Superstition, they didn't have doctors in the modern sense, but rather individuals who specialized in healing, often women known as wise women or healers. These healers possessed a knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties. They might have used herbs to treat wounds, ease pain, or fight infections. For example, yarrow was used to stop bleeding, while garlic was believed to have antiseptic properties. But remember, their understanding of why these remedies worked was limited. It was often a matter of trial and error, passed down through generations for more serious injuries like broken bones. The Vikings were surprisingly adept at setting fractures. Archaeological evidence shows that they were able to splint and bandage broken limbs, allowing them to heal properly. They may have even used willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, to help manage pain and inflammation. But when it came to internal illnesses, the Vikings were often at a loss. They might have used emetics or purgatives to try and cleanse the body, but these treatments could be harsh and potentially dangerous. And for many illnesses, their only recourse was to rely on prayer and sacrifice to the gods. Norse mythology played a significant role in their understanding of disease. They believed that illnesses could be caused by supernatural forces, such as curses, elves, or angry gods. In these cases, healing might involve rituals, charms, or sacrifices to appease the offended deities. For example, certain stones were believed to have protective properties against disease, and specific chants or incantations might be used to ward off evil spirits. While we might dismiss these practices as superstition, they likely provided some psychological comfort to those who were suffering. One interesting aspect of Viking society was their attitude towards disability. While they certainly valued strength and physical prowess, there's evidence that they also cared for those who were sick or disabled. Sagas mention individuals with disabilities being cared for by their families or communities, and archaeological finds have revealed burial sites of individuals with skeletal deformities or injuries that suggest they received long-term care. This challenges the stereotype of Vikings as purely ruthless warriors and highlights the importance of community support in their society. Of course, even with the best care, many Vikings succumbed to disease, the harsh living conditions, limited medical knowledge, and ever-present threat of infection meant that death was a frequent visitor to Viking villages. And when death did come, it was often a brutal and painful experience. So, let's recap. If you were transported back to a Viking fishing village, you'd be facing a constant barrage of health threats, from respiratory illnesses to waterborne diseases. From infected wounds to parasitic infestations, your body would be under constant assault. You'd have to rely on limited medical knowledge, herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness, and a healthy dose of prayer to survive. The reality is, disease and illness were an integral part of Viking life. They were a constant reminder of the fragility of human existence in a world without modern medicine. And while we might romanticize the Viking Age, it's important to remember the harsh realities that these people faced on a daily basis, especially in regards to the constant threat of sickness. In fact, it really makes you appreciate the simple luxury of a readily available pain reliever. Now, let's take a little breather and we'll get comfy before the next chapter. All right, friends, let's settle in for a cozy chat about Viking homes and families. Imagine a world without central heating, electric lights, or even, reliable plumbing. That's the Viking Age, right there. But even in a tough world, people build lives, create homes, and raise families. So, what was it like to be a Viking kid, a Viking mom, or even a Viking dad? Let's find out first. Let's talk about those Viking houses. When you picture a Viking home, you might imagine something grand, like a mead hall fit for Odin himself. But the truth is, most Vikings lived in pretty simple dwellings. Think cozy, not castle. The most common type of Viking home was the longhouse, and I mean long. These structures could be anywhere from 20 to 80 feet long, sometimes even longer. They were usually made of wood, wattle, and daub, that's basically woven sticks plastered with mud, or even turf, depending on what materials were available in the area. Now, imagine building one of these things. No power tools, no Home Depot, just you, your axe, and a whole lot of trees. It was hard work. The walls would be constructed by setting posts into the ground, then filling the gaps with wattle and daub or planks of wood. Turf houses, common in Iceland and Greenland, were built by stacking layers of sod to create thick, insulating walls. Talk about eco-friendly. The roof was typically made of thatch, which is dried straw or reeds. It was laid over a framework of wooden beams and rafters. Thatch was a great insulator, keeping the house warm in the winter and cool in the summer. But it also had its downsides. It could be a fire hazard, and it needed to be replaced every few years. Imagine the chore of re-thatching your roof every couple of years. Inside the longhouse, things were pretty simple. There was usually one large, open room that served as a living space, kitchen, and bedroom all rolled into one. Privacy? Not so much. The heart of the home was the hearth, a central fireplace that provided warmth, light, and a place to cook. The fire was kept burning almost constantly, which meant the longhouse was usually filled with smoke. It wasn't exactly the most well-ventilated space. Along the walls, you'd find benches that served as seating during the day and beds at night. Animal skins and woven tapestries might be used to add a bit of comfort and decoration. Storage chests were also common, used to store clothing, tools, and other belongings. Now, not every Viking lived in a longhouse. Some Vikings, especially those in towns and cities, lived in smaller, more compact houses. These houses were usually made of wood or stone, and they might have multiple rooms. But even these houses were pretty basic compared to modern homes, okay? So we've got the house. But what about the family? Viking families were typically large, with several children. Family was incredibly important in Viking society. It provided support, protection, and a sense of identity. The basic family unit was the nuclear family, mom, dad, and kids. But Viking families often included extended family members as well, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. These extended family members might live in the same longhouse or in nearby dwellings. Family was everything. The father was usually the head of the household. He was responsible for providing for his family, protecting them from harm, and making important decisions. He would have been the one to go fishing, trading, raiding even, whatever it took. The mother played a crucial role in managing the household. She was responsible for cooking, cleaning, weaving, and caring for the children. Viking women also had a surprising amount of power and independence. They could own property, run businesses, and even divorce their husbands. That's right, Viking women could call it quits. Children were an important part of the Viking family. They helped with chores around the house, such as fetching water, gathering firewood, and tending to animals. As they got older, they would learn valuable skills, such as farming, fishing, or crafting. Boys typically followed in their father's footsteps, learning the skills they would need to become warriors, traders, or farmers. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers, preparing them for their future roles as wives and mothers. And what about the roles? Let's break it down. Dads were often off doing stuff, fishing, trading, exploring, maybe a bit of raiding. The life of a Viking. Man was often one of adventure and danger, but it was also one of hard work and responsibility. They were expected to provide for their families and protect them from harm, which meant being skilled in combat and navigation. Moms, on the other hand, were the glue that held the family together. They were responsible for managing the household, raising the children, and ensuring that everyone was fed and clothed. But Viking women weren't just domestic goddesses. They also played a vital role in the community. They could own property, run businesses, and even participate in legal proceedings. Grandparents played a special role in Viking families. They were respected for their wisdom and experience, and they often helped to care for the grandchildren. Grandparents were the storytellers of the family, passing down tales of the past and teaching the younger generation about their heritage. Children in Viking society weren't exactly spending their days playing video games. They were workers. They had chores to do, skills to learn, and a future to prepare for. But they also had time for play and games. Viking children enjoyed playing with toys made of wood, bone, or clay. They played games like wrestling, running, and swimming. They also learned to play musical instruments such as the lyre and the flute. And let's not forget the pets. Dogs and cats were common in Viking homes. Dogs were used for hunting, herding, and guarding the home. Cats helped to control rodents, protecting food supplies from being eaten. Animals were part of the family. So, there you have it, a glimpse into Viking homes and family life. It wasn't always easy, but it was a life filled with love, community, and a deep connection. To the land and sea, it's easy to romanticize the past, but it's important to remember that life in a Viking fishing village was hard. The days were long, the work was strenuous, and the dangers were real. But it was also a life filled with purpose, camaraderie, and a sense of belonging. Even though they lived a long time ago, their lives weren't really all that different from ours. They had homes, families, and communities, and the same things we do, just in a different time. The long winter nights. Picture this, the biting wind howling outside, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, and the village cloaked in a blanket of snow. Fishing expeditions are impossible, the fields are barren, and the days are achingly short. Survival hinges on the stores laid up during the warmer months. But life can't be all about survival, can it? Humans need something more, something to nourish the soul, to chase away the gloom, to remind them that even in the darkest depths of winter, there's still warmth, still joy, still stories. For the Vikings, those long winter nights were prime time for storytelling. Think of it as their Netflix and chill, only with significantly less Netflix, but far more mead. Families would gather around the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, and then the stories would begin. These weren't just any stories, mind you. We're talking about sagas, epics that stretched back through generations. Tales of gods and goddesses, of heroes and monsters, of love and betrayal, and, of course, lots and lots of battles. Think of them as the Viking equivalent of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, only, again, with more mead and significantly less CGI. Imagine listening to these tales, passed down through generations, brought to life by a skilled storyteller. They knew how to weave a narrative, how to build suspense, how to use their voice to create vivid images in your mind. They were the special effects. A good storyteller could hold an audience spellbound for hours, transporting them to other worlds, making them feel like they were right there on the battlefield, or feasting in Valhalla. These stories served a lot of purposes, more than just simple entertainment. They were, first and foremost, a way to preserve history and tradition. Remember, the Vikings didn't have a written language for most of their history, or at least, they didn't use it to record these kinds of narratives. Everything was oral, passed down from one generation to the next through memory and performance. The sagas were their history books, their law books, their moral compass. They also helped to reinforce social values. The stories taught important lessons about courage, loyalty, honor, and the importance of family. They showed what it meant to be a good Viking, and what happened to those who strayed from the path. It was, you could say, a pretty effective form of social control, all wrapped up in a thrilling narrative. Be brave, be loyal, be honorable, or else face the wrath of Odin and the scorn of your community. And then there was the element of pure entertainment. Let's face it, life in a Viking village could be pretty tough. Winter was long, resources were scarce, and danger lurked around every corner. Stories offered an escape, a chance to forget the hardships of daily life and to immerse yourself in a world of adventure and excitement. They provided a sense of wonder, a glimpse of the extraordinary, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. Besides storytelling, the Vikings also had games to keep themselves occupied during the winter months. Now, when I say games, don't picture anything to elaborate. We're not talking about video games or board games. The Vikings preferred games that were simple, physical, and often a little bit dangerous. One popular game was known as Nefertafel, often called Viking chess. It involved two players with unequal forces, one defending a king in the center of the board, and the other trying to capture him. It was a game of strategy and tactics, requiring careful planning and a good understanding of your opponents. Moves, it was like chess, but with a slightly more Viking flavor of brutal simplicity. There were also dice games. The Vikings were avid gamblers, and they loved to bet on just about anything. Dice games were a popular way to pass the time and to try and win a few extra coins, or maybe a cow, or a sword, or whatever else they happened to have lying around. Sometimes, these games could get pretty heated, and arguments could break out over the results. But hey, that was just part of the fun. And, of course, there was always wrestling. It was a great way to stay in shape, to show off your strength and skill, and to assert your dominance within the community. Viking wrestling wasn't about fancy techniques or complicated rules. It was about brute force and determination, about grabbing your opponent and throwing him to the ground. The louder the cheer, the better the throw. But beyond the games and the sagas, perhaps the most important form of entertainment during the long winter nights was simply socializing, just spending time with family and friends, sharing stories, singing songs, and strengthening the bonds that held the community together. After all, in a world where survival depended on cooperation and mutual support, those bonds were more valuable than any treasure. Think of the scene. A group of Vikings gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their voices raised in song. Maybe they're singing about the gods, about their ancestors, or about their adventures on the sea. Maybe they're just singing about everyday life, about the joys and sorrows of their community. But whatever they're singing together, creating a sense of unity and belonging that transcends the darkness outside. These were moments of connection, of shared experience, of simple human joy. Moments that reminded them that even in the face of hardship and adversity, they were not alone. They were part of something bigger, something stronger, something that would endure long after the winter had passed, and perhaps that, more than anything else, is what helped them to survive those long, dark nights. These are things that, if you were in a Viking village, you'd be taking part in. You would have no choice. And if you couldn't socialize, your time in that village would be even shorter. Norse mythology wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a comprehensive worldview. It provided explanations for everything, from the creation of the cosmos to the unpredictable nature of the sea. It offered guidance, solace, and a framework for understanding the challenges and triumphs of daily life. Now, let's consider the grand tapestry of the Norse cosmos. At its heart lies Yggdrasil, the world tree. Just picture this immense ash tree, its roots stretching into the realms of the dead and its branches reaching towards the heavens. It connects the 9 worlds, each with its own inhabitants and character. We have Asgard, home of the Aesir gods, ruled by Odin, the All-Father. Then there's Midgard, the realm of humans, the very world the Vikings inhabited. And then there are Jotunheim, the land of the giants, Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, Alfheim, the realm of the light elves, Svartalfheim, the realm of the dark elves, Niflheim, a cold, dark realm of ice and mist, Muspelheim, a fiery realm of primordial chaos, and Hel, the realm of the dead, ruled by the goddess Hel. These weren't just places on a map. They were interwoven into the Viking understanding of their place in the universe. Every rustle of leaves could be a whisper from Yggdrasil. Every storm a sign of the giant's displeasure. Now, let's meet some of the key players in this divine drama. First, there's Odin, the All-Father, the god of wisdom, poetry, death, divination, and magic. He's often depicted with one eye, having sacrificed the other for a drink from the well of wisdom. He's a complex figure, a seeker of knowledge, and a powerful warrior. Then we have Thor, the god of thunder, strength, and the protector of mankind. He wields the mighty hammer Mjolnir, and his battles with the giants are legendary. He was, perhaps, the most popular god among the common people, as he represented strength and protection. Vital qualities in a harsh world. And of course, there's Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, gold, sire magic, and war. She is associated with both love and battle. She is a powerful and alluring figure. These gods weren't perfect beings. They were flawed, complex, and often unpredictable. Much like the humans who worship them, they experienced love, loss, jealousy, and anger. This made them relatable, even if they were also inspiring. The Vikings didn't just pray to these gods. They sought to emulate their virtues and learn from their mistakes. So, how did this mythology translate into the daily life of a Viking fishing village? Well, religious rituals were woven into the very fabric of their existence. The Vikings didn't have organized temples or a priestly class in the way we might imagine. Instead, religious practice was largely a personal and communal affair, often conducted outdoors in sacred groves or near prominent natural features. Blots, or sacrifices were common. These could involve offerings of food, drink, animals, and, in rare cases, even human sacrifices. Though the extent of human sacrifice is a matter of ongoing debate among historians. These sacrifices were performed to appease the gods, seek their favor, or give thanks for blessings received. Imagine a fisherman offering a portion of his catch to Njord, the god of the sea, hoping for safe voyages and plentiful harvests. Festivals and celebrations marked important times of the year. The winter nights, or Veternar, marked the beginning of winter and were a time for feasting and honoring the ancestors. Yule, or Jul, celebrated the winter solstice and the return of the sun. Sigrblot, celebrated in the spring, was a victory celebration and a time to ask for success in the coming year's ventures. These festivals weren't just religious observances. They were also important social events, a chance for the community to come together, strengthen bonds, and reaffirm their shared identity. Can you picture the village, torches blazing, with the sound of chanting and merriment filling the night? Air, sire, or Norse magic played a significant role, practiced by both men and women. It involved divination, healing, and influencing events through ritual and incantation. The sagas often depict women as powerful practitioners of sire, able to see the future, control the weather, and cast spells. Imagine a woman, a Velva or Cirrus, consulted before a major fishing expedition, using her skills to determine the best course of action and ensure a safe return for the fishermen. That role would have been powerful. Runes, an ancient alphabet, were also believed to possess magical properties. They were used for divination, protection, and inscribing spells on objects. A fisherman might carve runes onto his boat or his fishing tools to ensure a good catch. Norse mythology also influenced Viking ethics and values. The concept of word, often translated as fate or destiny, was central to their worldview. They believed that every individual's life was predetermined, but that this didn't excuse them from taking action and striving for honor. A Viking fisherman might believe that his success or failure was ultimately determined by fate, but he would still work hard, display courage, and face the challenges of the sea with unwavering determination. Honor was paramount. Vikings valued courage, loyalty, and strength. The concept of a good death was also very important. Dying bravely in battle, or facing death with courage in any situation, was seen as the ultimate achievement, ensuring a place in Valhalla. Odin's Hall for fallen warriors, the sagas, epic tales of heroes and gods, served as a source of entertainment, moral instruction, and historical record. These stories, passed down orally for generations, shaped the Viking worldview and provided examples of how to live a virtuous and honorable life. Imagine the long winter nights. Families gathered around the fire, listening to the skald or poet recite tales of Thor's battles with the giants, or the adventures of legendary heroes like Ragnar Lothbrok. Of course, the influence of Norse mythology wasn't uniform across all Viking communities. There were regional variations and individual interpretations as the Viking Age progressed. Contact with other cultures, particularly Christianity, led to the gradual decline of the old gods. Missionaries actively sought to convert the Vikings, and over time, Christianity replaced Norse mythology as the dominant religion in Scandinavia. But even with the rise of Christianity, elements of Norse mythology persisted. Many traditions and customs were blended with Christian beliefs, creating a unique syncretic culture. Traces of the old gods can still be found in Scandinavian folklore, language, and traditions. Even today, the names of the days of the week are derived from Norse gods, like Thursday, which is Thursday.so, the next time you see a Viking longship on a museum display, or read a saga about brave warriors and powerful gods, remember that. Norse mythology wasn't just a set of ancient stories. It was a living, breathing worldview that shaped the lives of the Vikings and their communities. It influenced their daily routines, their ethics, their values, and their understanding of their place in the cosmos. It was a world where the gods were real. Fate was unavoidable, and honor was everything. And now, as the waves gently crash on the shore of our imagined Viking village, and the echoes of ancient rituals fade into the night, let us consider the final chapter of the Viking story, death and burial. All right, let's gently step into the final moments of a Viking's life and how those left behind honored. Their memory, it's a bit somber, but also a deeply fascinating part of their world. Death was, of course, an unavoidable part of life in a Viking fishing village. Life was hard, the sea was unforgiving, and medical knowledge was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly advanced. So, when someone passed away, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a community event, steeped in tradition and belief. Now, the Vikings had a very specific worldview, heavily influenced by their Norse mythology. They didn't see death as simply the end, but as a transition, a journey to one of several possible afterlives, each with its own characteristics. One of the most well-known of these afterlives is Valhalla. This was the Hall of Odin, the All-Father, and it was reserved for warriors who died bravely in battle. Imagine a massive, golden hall, filled with feasting and fighting, where the chosen warriors spent their days preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. It was a pretty exclusive club, to say the least. To get there, you'd have to impress the Valkyries, Odin's shield maidens, who swooped down onto the battlefield to select the worthy. But Valhalla wasn't the only option. There was also Folkvanger, ruled by the goddess Freyja. This was also a destination for those who died in battle, and some sagas suggest that Freyja actually got first pick of the fallen, before Odin. So, if you were a particularly skilled or favored warrior, you might find yourself in Folkvanger instead. What Folkvanger was actually like is a little vague. The records are a bit less descriptive than they are with Valhalla, and then there was Hell. This wasn't exactly a place you wanted to end up. Hell was the realm of the goddess of the same name, and it was where those who died of old age, sickness, or simply weren't considered worthy of Valhalla or Folkvanger went. It wasn't necessarily a place of punishment, but it was often described as a dark, gloomy, and rather unpleasant place. The Vikings' beliefs about the afterlife heavily influenced their funeral customs. They believed that the deceased would need certain things for their journey to the next world, and that their earthly possessions could accompany them. This led to some pretty elaborate and fascinating burial rituals. The most famous, and perhaps the most dramatic, Viking funeral was the ship burial. This was usually reserved for high-ranking individuals, like chieftains or wealthy warriors. The deceased would be placed on a ship, often with valuable grave goods like weapons, jewelry, tools, and even sacrificed animals, in some cases, accounts. Even tell of slaves being sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife, although the truth of those accounts remains a matter of debate among historians. The ship would then be set ablaze, either out at sea or on land. The flames were meant to carry the deceased soul to the afterlife. It was a powerful and visually stunning way to send someone off, and of course, it meant that you'd never have to worry about them complaining about a long journey. But ship burials weren't the only option. Not everyone could afford such a lavish send-off. More common were cremation burials on land. The body would be placed on a pyre, along with grave goods, and then set alight. The ashes would then be collected and placed in an urn, or simply buried in the ground. Another common practice was the burial mound. The deceased would be buried in a grave, and then a mound of earth would be built over it. These mounds could range in size from small bumps to large, imposing structures. They often served as landmarks and were sometimes used for ceremonial purposes, regardless of the specific type of burial. Grave goods were almost always included. These items were meant to help the deceased in the afterlife, and they varied depending on the person's status and wealth. Weapons were common for warriors, tools for craftsmen, jewelry for women, and so on. Food and drink were also often included to sustain the deceased on their journey. The Vikings also believed in the importance of honoring the dead. They would often hold feasts and celebrations in memory of the deceased, and tell stories about their lives and accomplishments. These events served to keep the memory of the deceased alive, and to reinforce the bonds of community. Now, one aspect of Viking funerals that has captured the imagination of many is the potential for human sacrifice. As I mentioned earlier, some accounts, particularly those from outside observers like the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe slaves being sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife. The details of these accounts are often quite gruesome and involve elaborate rituals. However, it's important to note that the extent to which human sacrifice was practiced by the Vikings is a matter of debate among historians. Some argue that it was a relatively rare occurrence, reserved for only the most exceptional circumstances. Others believe that it was more widespread than the archaeological evidence suggests. The truth is, we may never know for sure. The evidence is scarce, and the accounts are often biased or incomplete. What we do know is that the Vikings took death very seriously, and they had elaborate rituals and beliefs surrounding it. Their funeral customs were designed to honor the deceased, to provide them with what they needed for the afterlife, and to ensure that their memory lived on. So, if you found yourself in a Viking fishing village and someone passed away, you likely witnessed a deeply moving and complex ceremony. You'd see the community come together to mourn their loss, to celebrate the life of the deceased, and to send them off on their final journey. It would be a reminder of the harsh realities of Viking life, but also of their profound sense of community and their unwavering belief in the afterlife. It's a fascinating glimpse into a world that, while brutal, was also rich in meaning and tradition, isn't it? And now, let's drift into a somewhat lighter topic, as we consider how Vikings interacted with people outside of their own little villages. All right, let's gently step into the final moments of a Viking's life and how those left behind honored their memory. It's a bit somber, but also a deeply fascinating part of their world. Death was, of course, an unavoidable part of life in a Viking fishing village. Life was hard, the sea was unforgiving, and medical knowledge was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly advanced. So, when someone passed away, it wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a community event, steeped in tradition and belief. Now, the Vikings had a very specific worldview, heavily influenced by their Norse mythology. They didn't see death as simply the end, but as a transition, a journey to one of several possible afterlives, each with its own characteristics. One of the most well-known of these afterlives is Valhalla. This was the Hall of Odin, the All-Father, and it was reserved for warriors who died bravely in battle. Imagine a massive, golden hall filled with feasting and fighting, where the chosen warriors spent their days preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. It was a pretty exclusive club, to say the least. To get there, you'd have to impress the Valkyries, Odin's shield maidens, who swooped down onto the battlefield to select the worthy. But Valhalla wasn't the only option. There was also Folkvanger, ruled by the goddess Freyja. This was also a destination for those who died in battle, and some sagas suggest that Freyja actually got first pick of the fallen, before Odin. So, if you were a particularly skilled or favored warrior, you might find yourself in Folkvanger instead. What Folkvanger was actually like is a little vague. The records are a bit less descriptive than They are with Valhalla, and then there was Hell. This wasn't exactly a place you wanted to end up. Hell was the realm of the goddess of the same name, and it was where those who died of old age, sickness, or simply weren't considered worthy of Valhalla or Folkvanger went. It wasn't necessarily a place of punishment, but it was often described as a dark, gloomy, and rather unpleasant place. The Vikings' beliefs about the afterlife heavily influenced their funeral customs. They believed that the deceased would need certain things for their journey to the next world, and that their earthly possessions could accompany them. This led to some pretty elaborate and fascinating burial rituals. The most famous, and perhaps the most dramatic, Viking funeral was the ship burial. This was usually reserved for high-ranking individuals like chieftains or wealthy warriors. The deceased would be placed on a ship, often with valuable grave. Goods like weapons, jewelry, tools, and even sacrificed animals. In some cases, accounts even tell of slaves being sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife, although the truth of those accounts remains a matter of debate among historians. The ship would then be set ablaze, either out at sea or on land. The flames were meant to carry the deceased's soul to the afterlife. It was a powerful and visually stunning way to send someone off, and of course, it meant that you'd never have to worry about them complaining about a long journey. But ship burials weren't the only option. Not everyone could afford such a lavish send-off. More common were cremation burials on land. The body would be placed on a pyre, along with grave goods, and then set alight. The ashes would then be collected and placed in an urn, or simply buried in the ground. Another common practice was the burial mound. The deceased would be buried in a grave, and then a mound of earth would be built over it. These mounds could range in size from small bumps to large, imposing structures. They often served as landmarks and were sometimes used for ceremonial purposes. Regardless of the specific type of burial, grave goods were almost always included. These items were meant to help the deceased in the afterlife, and they varied depending on the person's status and wealth. Weapons were common for warriors, tools for craftsmen, jewelry for women, and so on. Food and drink were also often included to sustain the deceased on their journey. The Vikings also believed in the importance of honoring the dead. They would often hold feasts and celebrations in memory of the deceased, and tell stories about their lives and accomplishments. These events served to keep the memory of the deceased alive, and to reinforce the bonds of community. Now, one aspect of Viking funerals that has captured the imagination of many is the potential for human sacrifice. As I mentioned earlier, some accounts, particularly those from outside observers like the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe slaves being sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife. The details of these accounts are often quite gruesome and involve elaborate rituals. However, it's important to note that the extent to which human sacrifice was practiced by the Vikings is a matter of debate among historians. Some argue that it was a relatively rare occurrence, reserved for only the most exceptional circumstances. Others believe that it was more widespread than the archaeological evidence suggests. The truth is, we may never know for sure. The evidence is scarce, and the accounts are often biased or incomplete. What we do know is that the Vikings took death very seriously, and they had elaborate rituals and beliefs surrounding it. Their funeral customs were designed to honor the deceased, to provide them with what they needed for the afterlife, and to ensure that their memory lived on. So, if you found yourself in a Viking fishing village and someone passed away, you'd likely witness a deeply moving and complex ceremony. You'd see the community come together to mourn their loss, to celebrate the life of the deceased, and to send them off on their final journey. It would be a reminder of the harsh realities of Viking life, but also of their profound sense of community and their unwavering belief in the afterlife. It's a fascinating glimpse into a world that, while brutal, was also rich in meaning and tradition, isn't it? And now, let's drift into a somewhat lighter topic, as we consider how Vikings interacted with people outside of their own little villages. All right, gather round, settle in nice and cozy, because tonight we're diving headfirst into the often turbulent world of Viking interactions with Well, everyone else. Vikings weren't exactly known for their diplomacy first and pillage later strategy. But there's more to the story than just axes and longships. So, let's explore the good, the bad, and the downright bloody when it came to Vikings dealing with folks outside their own villages. Because you wouldn't want to misstep and end up on the wrong end of a SEAX. First off, let's address the elephant in the longhouse, raiding. It's kind of their brand, isn't it? But why did they raid? Pure villainy? Probably not. Resource scarcity in Scandinavia definitely played a huge role. Imagine trying to farm on rocky soil with short growing seasons. Suddenly, the allure of plundering. A monastery brimming with gold and grain becomes, shall we say, a tempting proposition. Think of it like this: your village is struggling to make ends meet, the fish aren't biting, and the crops are failing. Word reaches you of a nearby kingdom practically overflowing with wealth. Is raiding the nicest solution? No. But is it a survival solution? Potentially. Now, when the Vikings raided, they weren't exactly subtle. Coastal monasteries and undefended settlements were prime targets. England, Ireland, and France, especially, felt the sting of Viking raids. The Lindisfarne raid in 793 is often cited as the beginning of the Viking Age, and it sent shockwaves through Christendom. These weren't just quick smash and grab jobs either. Vikings often established winter camps and used them as bases for further expeditions inland. But here's a crucial point: raiding wasn't always indiscriminate slaughter. While violence was certainly a factor, Vikings also sought valuable goods, slaves, and sometimes even land. They were pragmatic. If a settlement offered tribute, often called Danegeld in England, the Vikings might just pack up and leave, at least for a while. Think of it as an early form of protection money. Nasty? Absolutely. Effective? Undeniably. So, what happened when Vikings encountered resistance? Well, battles ensued, of course. Viking warriors were formidable, and their weapons, like the Dane, axe and swords, were pretty terrifying. Their tactics often involved surprise attacks and exploiting weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. The shield wall formation was a common tactic, creating an almost impenetrable barrier of wood and steel. However, they weren't invincible. Well-organized armies and fortified settlements could put up a serious fight, and the Vikings definitely suffered defeats, but not every interaction was hostile. Vikings were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Their longships weren't just for raiding. They were incredibly versatile vessels that allowed them to navigate rivers, cross oceans, and explore new territories. They established trade routes that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, exchanging goods like furs, slaves, and amber for silver, spices, and other luxury items. Think of the Vikings as early international merchants. They weren't just smashing and grabbing, they were also building economic networks. They traded with the Byzantine Empire, the Arab world, and various Slavic tribes. These interactions fostered cultural exchange, with Vikings adopting new customs, technologies, and even religions. For example, the Rus Vikings who ventured down the rivers of Eastern Europe played a significant role in the establishment of what would eventually become Russia. They traded with the Byzantine Empire, and some even served as mercenaries in the Byzantine army, the famed Varangian Guard. These Vikings didn't just conquer. They integrated, influenced, and in turn, were influenced by the cultures they encountered. Then there's the settlement aspect. Vikings didn't just raid and trade. They also established permanent settlements in places like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, albeit briefly. These settlements weren't just military outposts. They were attempts to create new societies, adapt to new environments, and establish a foothold in foreign lands. Take Iceland, for instance. It was largely uninhabited when the Vikings arrived, and they created a unique society with its own laws, customs, and sagas. They adapted to the harsh climate, developed sustainable farming practices, and preserved their cultural heritage. Iceland became a Viking stronghold, a testament to their adaptability and resilience. But even in these settlements, conflicts arose. the Vikings weren't exactly a homogeneous group. Internal disputes, power struggles, and clashes with indigenous populations were common. The Greenland settlements, for example, eventually failed, possibly due to climate change, resource depletion, and conflicts with the Inuit. So, how did Vikings deal with cultures that were very different from their own? It wasn't always pretty. Viking society had a rigid social hierarchy, and they often viewed outsiders as inferior. Slavery was a common practice, and captured enemies were often enslaved or sold into slavery. Religious differences also fueled conflict. The Vikings were initially pagan, worshipping gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, and they often clashed with Christian communities. However, the Vikings were also pragmatic. They often adopted elements of other cultures that they found useful or beneficial. Many Vikings eventually converted to Christianity, some willingly, others perhaps under pressure from powerful rulers. They also incorporated foreign technologies and ideas into their own society. Think of it as a cultural melting pot, albeit a rather violent one at times. The Vikings weren't isolated. They were constantly interacting with other cultures, and these interactions shaped their own society in profound ways. They raided, traded, settled, and integrated, leaving a lasting mark on the history of Europe and beyond. So, what can we learn from all this? Well, Viking interactions with other cultures were complex and multifaceted. They weren't simply bloodthirsty barbarians. They were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Their interactions involved violence, but also diplomacy, cultural exchange, and adaptation. And, frankly, most of us probably wouldn't last a day navigating those interactions. The cultural differences, the constant threat of violence, the sheer brutality of Viking life. It was a different world, a world that demanded resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to embrace both the good and the bad. So, next time you see a horned helmet, remember that there's more to the Viking story than just raiding and pillaging. There's a story of cultural clash, of survival, and of a people who left their mark on the world, for better or for worse. Now, sleep tight and don't let the draugr bite. All right, friends, let's settle in and talk about something absolutely essential to survival, especially back in Viking times, adapting to the changing seasons. Now, imagine you're not just popping into a village for a quick vacation. You're living there. Your survival, your family's survival, depends on understanding and responding to the rhythms of nature. It's a lot. Let's cozy in and try to get a handle on it, shall we? Okay, so forget popping into the grocery store for whatever you fancy anytime. The seasons dictate everything a Viking fishing village does. We're talking about a world where the weather isn't just a mild inconvenience, it's a make or break factor. Each season brings its own set of challenges and opportunities, and the Vikings were incredibly skilled at adapting. It's honestly kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Let's start with the most brutal of all, winter. Winter. Think long, dark nights. Think freezing temperatures. Think of the North Sea turning into an absolute monster. Fishing becomes incredibly dangerous, if not impossible, for extended periods. So, what does a Viking fishing village do when they can't reliably fish? Well, first, they prepare. The warmer months, from spring to autumn, become a mad dash of intense activity. They're catching and preserving as much fish as humanly possible. We're talking about smoking, salting, drying, anything to keep the food supply going when the storms rage. Seriously, it's intense. Think about it. You've got the women and children working tirelessly on the shore, processing the catches as they come in. You've got everyone involved doing their part. This isn't leisure time. It's a race against the clock. They're building up a stockpile that needs to last them through months of hardship. But even with the best preparation, winter is still tough. Food stores dwindle. The days are short, and the nights are long and cold. The Vikings turn inward. It's a time for community, for storytelling around the hearth, for reinforcing those social bonds that are so crucial for surviving together. Crafting becomes even more important in winter. With less time spent fishing, people focus on repairing nets, making tools, weaving cloth, and creating those essential items that will be needed in the coming year. It's all about resourcefulness. Seriously, there's a lesson in that. And let's not forget the mental toll. Imagine being stuck inside for weeks on end with limited sunlight and dwindling food supplies. The psychological strain must have been immense. That's why storytelling and communal activities were so important. They provided a sense of hope and connection in the face of adversity. Now, let's move on to spring. Spring. After the long winter, spring must have felt like a true rebirth. The ice thaws, the days get longer, and the fishing season slowly starts to resume. It's a time of hope and renewal, but also a time of intense labor. Spring isn't just about getting back out on the water. It's a time for repairing the damage that winter has wrought. Think about boats needing mending, homes needing repair, and fields needing to be prepared for planting if they were doing any farming, which many fishing villages did to supplement their diet. It's a flurry of activity. The first catches of spring are celebrated. They're not just food, they're a symbol of survival, a sign that the worst is over. There's a sense of gratitude, a recognition of the bounty that the sea provides. And spring isn't just about the physical world. It's also a time for social gatherings, for reaffirming relationships that might have been strained during the long winter. It's a chance to reconnect with neighbors and celebrate the return of life. Summer. The golden time. The days are long, the weather is relatively mild, and the fishing is at its peak. This is the time to replenish those depleted stores, to build up a surplus that will see them through the next winter. Summer is also a time for exploration and trade. With calmer seas, Vikings could venture further afield, trading with other settlements or even engaging in, well, let's just say resource acquisition, shall we? It was a time of opportunity, a chance to expand their horizons and bring new resources. Back to the village. It's not all sunshine and roses, though. Summer could also bring storms, and the longer voyages always carried risks. But the potential rewards made it worth the gamble. Summer is also when they have time for important tasks, such as tending to their livestock, if they have any, that is. Summer can be quite nice indeed. Finally, let's talk about autumn. Autumn is a transition period, a time of both abundance and preparation. The fishing season is still good, but the days are getting shorter, and the weather is becoming more unpredictable. Autumn is the time to bring in the harvest, to gather any remaining resources, and to make those final preparations for winter. It's a time for assessing their stores, identifying any potential shortages, and making plans to address them. It's a crucial period of planning and preparation. Autumn is also a time for reflection, for remembering those who didn't make it through the previous winter, and for honoring the spirits of the ancestors. It's a time for reinforcing those cultural traditions that bind the community together. And that, in a nutshell, is how Vikings adapted to the changing seasons. It wasn't easy. It required a deep understanding of the environment, a willingness to work hard, and a strong sense of community. But by embracing the rhythms of nature, they were able to not just survive, but thrive in a harsh and unforgiving world. Think about that level of connection to the environment. We're so disconnected today, ordering food online without a thought to the seasons or the effort involved in producing it. The Vikings didn't have that luxury. They were intimately aware of the cycles of nature, and their lives depended on respecting those cycles. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? It makes you realize how much we've lost in our modern world, and how much we could learn from those who lived closer to the earth. And that's what makes it worth our time to explore and understand them, really. So, the next time you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, remember the Vikings and their fishing villages. Remember their connection to the seasons, their resilience in the face of adversity, and their unwavering commitment to community. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find a little bit of that Viking spirit within yourself. Friends, settle in, because we're about to delve into a perhaps uncomfortable topic, one that's easy to overlook when we romanticize history. But trust me, it's a really important one. The psychological toll of living in a Viking fishing village. Imagine, if you will, that you're transported back in time, not for a fun little vacation or historical reenactment, You're there, living it day in, day out, in the heart of a Viking fishing community. Sounds brutal, right? Well, beyond the physical hardships we've talked about, the relentless work, the brutal weather, the limited food, there's a whole other layer of challenges, and that's what we need to explore: the mental and emotional impact of this harsh environment. Let's just start with, honestly, the constant stress. It would be everywhere. Survival itself is a stressor. Every day is a fight against the elements, against potential food shortages, and quite frankly, against other people. These weren't exactly the most peaceful societies. Remember, think about the fishermen. Their lives were perpetually on the line. They were battling unpredictable seas in small, open boats. A sudden storm, a rogue wave. It could all be over in a heartbeat, and they knew it. Every time they pushed off from shore, there was a very real chance they wouldn't come back. That would be terrifying, even when they were successful. There was the constant pressure to bring in enough fish to feed their families and the village. Failure meant hunger, hardship, and potential social ostracism. That's a lot to carry on your shoulders every single day. But it wasn't just the fishermen who were stressed. The women, who are often unsung heroes of Viking society, faced their own unique pressures. They were responsible for managing the household, raising children, preserving food, and often taking on additional tasks like weaving, spinning, and even brewing. And they did this all in an environment where resources were scarce and support systems were limited. And of course, they lived with the knowledge that their husbands, sons, and brothers were risking their lives at sea every single day. That is a continuous state of anxiety. Then there's the ever-present threat of violence. Viking society was, well, it was violent. Raiding was a way of life for some. Even within the village, disputes could escalate quickly into physical confrontations. Imagine the psychological impact of living in a world where you constantly have to be on guard, ready to defend yourself and your family, where trust is a precious commodity and betrayal is a constant possibility. That kind of environment breeds paranoia, suspicion, and a deep-seated sense of insecurity. And, of course, there was the trauma. I mean, let's not sugarcoat this. Viking life was full of traumatic experiences, shipwrecks, battles, raids. The deaths of loved ones from disease or violence, these were all common occurrences. In the modern world, we have access to therapy, counseling, and other forms of mental health support to help us process trauma. But in a Viking village, there was nothing. People were left to cope with these experiences on their own, often in silence, with very little understanding of the psychological impact that we know now. That untreated trauma can lead to a whole host of mental health problems, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, and substance abuse. It's reasonable to assume that these conditions were prevalent in Viking society, even if they didn't have labels for them as we do now. The impact of witnessing violence, especially on children, cannot be overstated. Children growing up in that environment would have been exposed to things that no child should ever see. This can have lasting effects on their development, their relationships, and their overall well-being. And what about the emotional toll of grief? Death was a constant presence in Viking life. The loss of a child, a spouse, a parent, it would have been a regular experience. And while Viking culture had rituals for mourning and honoring the dead, there was little room for prolonged displays of grief. People had to keep going. They had to keep working, keep providing, keep surviving. There was no time to wallow in sorrow. This kind of suppressed grief can have devastating consequences on mental health. Furthermore, it's worth considering the societal norms surrounding mental health. In a warrior culture that valued strength, stoicism, and emotional control, displays of vulnerability would have been frowned upon. Men, in particular, may have felt pressure to suppress their emotions, to hide their pain, for fear of being seen as weak or unmanly. Women, while perhaps having more social permission to express emotions, still faced limited options for seeking support. They would likely turn to other women in their community for comfort and advice. But these informal support networks were hardly a substitute for professional mental health care. And let's not forget about isolation. While Viking villages were close-knit communities in some ways, they could also be incredibly isolating. People were often trapped in their roles, their circumstances, with limited opportunities for social mobility or personal growth. Those who didn't fit in, who struggled with the demands of Viking life, may have experienced a profound sense of alienation and loneliness. This could have been particularly true for individuals with mental health conditions that made it difficult for them to function in society. And unfortunately, there's evidence that mental illness was often misunderstood and stigmatized. Individuals with unusual behavior or cognitive impairments may have been seen as cursed, possessed, or simply mad. They may have been ostracized, abused, or even killed. Now, I'm not saying that Vikings were inherently cruel or heartless. They were products of their time and their culture. They lived in a world where survival was paramount, and mental health was simply not a priority. But it's important to recognize that their way of life came at a significant psychological cost. The constant stress, the threat of violence, the trauma, the grief, the isolation, these were all factors that would have taken a heavy toll on the mental and emotional well-being of individuals in a Viking fishing village. And when we consider all of this, the question isn't just could we survive a day in a Viking fishing village, but at what cost? What would it do to us? What would it do to our minds and our souls? It's a sobering thought, isn't it? But it's a reminder that progress isn't just about technology or material comfort. It's also about our understanding of human psychology, our ability to empathize with others, and our commitment to creating societies that support mental health and well-being. So, the next time you see a movie or TV show glorifying Viking life, remember the hidden cost. Remember the stress, the trauma, and the psychological toll, and be grateful for the relative peace and security that we enjoy today. All right, let's gently extract some wisdom from our Viking friends, shall we? After all, enduring those harsh conditions must have taught them a thing or two that even our modern, climate-controlled lives can benefit from. First off, and perhaps most obviously, is the lesson of resilience. Imagine waking up every single day knowing you're going to face potential danger, that the weather could turn at any moment, that your next meal isn't guaranteed. This wasn't just a bad day at the office for the Vikings, it was their reality. Day in and day out, modern society, particularly in the developed world, has become incredibly comfortable. We expect convenience, instant gratification, and a relatively predictable existence. But what happens when the unexpected hits? A job loss, a natural disaster, a global pandemic. Suddenly, we're faced with challenges we're often ill-equipped to handle, both practically and mentally. The Vikings, on the other hand, were forged in the fires of adversity. They developed a mental toughness, an inner fortitude, that allowed them to weather storms, both literal and figurative. They didn't have the luxury of falling apart. They had to keep going, had to keep rowing, had to keep surviving. Now, I'm not suggesting we all go out and start pillaging coastal villages to toughen up. Goodness no. But we can learn to cultivate that same resilience by intentionally stepping outside our comfort zones. Take on a challenging project, learn a new skill, embrace discomfort instead of running from it. Build your own inner Viking, ready to face whatever the world throws your way. Think of it as mental weightlifting. The more you challenge yourself, the stronger you become. And that leads into the power of adaptation. Living in a Viking fishing village demanded a constant willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. One day, the fish are plentiful. The next, a storm rolls in, and you're lucky to escape with your lives. They couldn't rely on things staying the same, and so they became masters of improvisation and problem solving. Our modern world is also changing at an increasingly rapid pace, with technological advancements, economic shifts, and environmental challenges constantly reshaping our lives. Those who cling rigidly to the past are often left behind, struggling to adapt to the new reality. The Vikings, with their open-mindedness and willingness to experiment, offer a valuable lesson in embracing change. They are constantly innovating, developing new boat designs, refining their fishing techniques, adapting their strategies for trade and warfare. They understood that stagnation meant decline. We can apply that same principle to our own lives by cultivating a growth mindset, by being open to new ideas, and by continuously learning and evolving. Don't be afraid to try new things, to challenge your assumptions, and to adapt your approach when things aren't working. After all, even the fiercest Viking had to adjust their sails to navigate changing winds. Now, let's drift over to another crucial aspect of Viking life: community. Living in those small, isolated villages demanded a strong sense of interdependence and mutual support. They knew that their survival depended on working together, on sharing resources, and on looking out for one another. There was no room for individualism in the face of starvation or a raiding party. In modern society, we've become increasingly disconnected from our communities. We often live in sprawling suburbs, interact primarily online, and rely on impersonal institutions to provide for our needs. While this independence has its benefits, it can also lead to feelings of isolation, loneliness, and a lack of social cohesion. The Vikings remind us of the importance of building strong, supportive communities. Volunteer your time, get to know your neighbors, participate in local events, offer help to those in need, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it yourself. Rebuild those connections, foster a sense of belonging, and create a network of support that can weather any storm. Remember, even the mightiest Viking warrior needed their fellow shield brothers to have their back in battle. This emphasis on community extends to a broader sense of social responsibility. The Vikings understood that their actions had consequences. For the entire village, they couldn't afford to be selfish or irresponsible, as their behavior directly impacted the well-being of everyone around them. In our modern world, where individual consumption often trumps collective concerns, we can learn from the Vikings' sense of interconnectedness. Consider the environmental impact of your choices, support ethical businesses, and advocate for policies that benefit the community as a whole. Remember that we're all in this boat together, and that our individual actions contribute to the overall health and well-being of society. Every small act of kindness, every conscious consumption decision, every effort to promote social justice helps to create a more resilient and sustainable future for all. Another valuable takeaway from Viking life is a renewed appreciation for essential skills. In our highly specialized modern world, we've often outsourced basic skills to experts. We rely on plumbers to fix our pipes, mechanics to repair our cars, and chefs to cook our meals. While specialization has its advantages, it can also leave us vulnerable and dependent on others. The Vikings, on the other hand, were jacks of all trades. They knew how to build a boat, mend a net, treat an injury, and defend themselves in combat. They possessed a range of practical skills that allowed them to be self-sufficient and resilient. Now, I'm not suggesting we all become survivalists living off the grid, but we can benefit from acquiring a few essential skills. Learn to cook a simple meal, fix a leaky faucet, or administer basic first aid. Not only will these skills save you time and money, but they'll also give you a greater sense of confidence and self-reliance. Plus, they provide a valuable connection to the tangible world, grounding us in a way that our increasingly digital lives often lack. It brings you back down to earth. Finally, the Vikings teach us the importance of living in harmony with nature. Their lives were intimately connected to the natural world, and they possessed a deep understanding of its rhythms and cycles. They knew how to read the weather, navigate by the stars, and harvest resources sustainably. In our modern world, where we're often insulated from nature, we can learn to reconnect with the natural world and appreciate its beauty and fragility. Spend time outdoors, learn about the local ecosystem, and adopt sustainable practices in your daily life. Remember, the Vikings respected the power of the sea, the fury of the storm, and the bounty of the land. By embracing that same respect, we can create a more sustainable and harmonious relationship with the planet that sustains us. And so, as we reflect on the lessons gleaned from a Viking fishing village, we can see that these ancient seafarers offer more than just tales of conquest and adventure. They remind us of the importance of resilience, adaptation, community, essential skills and living in harmony with nature. By embracing these principles, we can cultivate a more meaningful and fulfilling life, ready to face whatever challenges the modern world throws our way. And maybe, just maybe, we'd last a little longer in that Viking village than we thought. Sweet dreams. All right, let's settle in for a bit and sort out some of the tall tales that have grown up around our Viking friends, the ones that have popped up in movies, TV shows, and even some questionable history books. It's time to separate the horn helmets from the historical happenings, shall we? First up, let's talk about those horns. The image of Vikings charging into battle with huge, curving horns sprouting from their helmets is practically iconic, isn't it? But here's the thing, there's absolutely no archaeological evidence to support this. Zero. Nada. Not a single horn helmet has ever been found in a Viking grave or settlement. So, where did this image come from? Well, it seems to be a bit of a 19th century invention, likely inspired by theatrical productions and romanticized depictions of the Norse costumes. You see, needed to be visually striking. Think Wagnerian operas, big, dramatic, and not necessarily historically accurate. Horns looked impressive, and the idea just stuck. The real Viking helmets were much more practical, often simple, conical designs made of leather or iron, sometimes with a face guard for extra protection. No horns to get snagged on branches or knocked off in a fight. That wouldn't be very practical, would it? Next, let's tackle the idea of Vikings as mindless berserkers, constantly in a bloodthirsty rage. Now, there's no denying that Vikings could be fierce warriors. Raiding and pillaging were definitely part of their culture, especially in certain periods. But portraying them as nothing more than unthinking brutes is a gross oversimplification. Think about it, building longships, navigating by the stars, establishing trade routes across vast distances. These activities required intelligence, planning, and complex social organization. The sagas, the epic stories of the Norse, are filled with characters who are cunning, eloquent, and driven by more than just a desire for violence. Sure, there are berserkers in the sagas, warriors said to enter a trance-like fury in battle, but they were probably a relatively small and specialized group, and the sagas might exaggerate their abilities for dramatic effect. In short, Vikings were people. Some were fierce warriors, yes, but most were farmers, traders, craftsmen, and family members just trying to make a life in a harsh world. Another common myth is that Vikings were uniquely dirty and unhygienic. This is a bit unfair, really. While they might not have had access to modern plumbing or sanitation systems, Vikings actually seem to have been surprisingly concerned about personal hygiene, at least relative to other groups in Europe at the time. Archaeological finds have uncovered combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and other grooming tools in Viking graves, suggesting that they took pride in their appearance. The sagas also mention bathing and changing clothes regularly, particularly before important social events. And, perhaps surprisingly, some evidence even suggests that Vikings used soap. They would bathe in tubs on Saturdays, which makes you think, maybe they weren't all that bad. Now, let's move on to the stereotype of Vikings as exclusively Scandinavian. While the vast majority of Vikings did indeed come from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Viking society was actually quite diverse. People from other parts of Europe, including the British Isles and even further afield, were often integrated into Viking communities, either as slaves, traders, or even warriors. Think about it. The Vikings were constantly raiding and trading across vast distances. They inevitably came into contact with people from different cultures and backgrounds. Some of those people were taken back to Scandinavia, either willingly or unwillingly, and became part of Viking society. So, while the core of Viking culture remained Scandinavian, it was also influenced by interactions with other groups. It wasn't exclusive, like many stereotypes might have you believe. Another interesting misconception is that Vikings were always on the move, constantly raiding and exploring. While raiding and exploration were definitely important aspects of Viking culture, the vast majority of Vikings were actually farmers who spent most of their time tending to their fields and livestock. Agriculture was the foundation of the Viking economy, and most Vikings lived relatively settled lives in small villages and farms. Raiding expeditions were often seasonal activities, undertaken during the summer months when the seas were calmer and the days were longer. Then they would go home. Finally, let's address the idea that the Viking Age was a sudden and dramatic event that abruptly ended. In reality, the Viking Age was a gradual process that spanned several centuries, from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century. The decline of the Viking Age was also a gradual process influenced by a variety of factors, including the rise of centralized kingdoms in Scandinavia, the adoption of Christianity, and the changing economic and political landscape of Europe. It didn't end one day. So, there you have it. Just a few of the many myths and misconceptions that have grown up around the Vikings. By separating fact from fiction, we can gain a more nuanced and accurate understanding of this fascinating and complex culture. It's important to remember that the Vikings were real people, with their own strengths and weaknesses, their own hopes and fears. They weren't just the one-dimensional caricatures that we often see in popular culture, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we go through these things, right? Well, friends, here we are. After our intense day in a Viking fishing village, it's time to take a moment, take a breath, and, well, maybe lie down for a bit. Because, let's be honest, even imagining that day has been exhausting, hasn't it? So, we've woken up with the sun, smelled the unique aromas of a Viking settlement, wrestled with chores that would leave a modern gym-goer weeping, choked down food that would make a toddler turn up their nose, battled the elements in clothing that offered minimal protection, risked life and limb on the open sea, and, well, the list just goes on, doesn't it? But now, as the imaginary sun sets on our day, and the imaginary longhouse fire crackles softly beside us, it's time to reflect, to really think about what we've just experienced, even if it was all in our heads. Because here's the thing, Viking life wasn't romantic. Not really, sure. The sagas are full of heroes and epic battles, and the idea of exploring new lands has a certain allure. But the reality, the day-to-day grind, that was something else entirely. Think about the sheer physicality of it all. Every single task, from fetching water to hauling fishing nets, required immense strength and endurance. There were no machines, no power tools, no convenient grocery stores stocked with pre-packaged meals, just raw muscle power and the relentless demands of survival. We, in our modern comfort, have lost that connection to the physical world. We're soft, and a soft body makes for a soft mind. Asterisk, asterisk, and then there's the constant danger. The sea itself was a deadly foe, capable of swallowing ships whole with little warning. Accidents were commonplace, injuries were frequent, and medical care, well, let's just say you were better off praying to the gods than relying on Viking. First aid. There was no safety net, no ambulance on standby, no guarantee of survival. Life was precarious, incredibly precarious, but beyond the physical challenges and the constant threat of death, there was also the emotional toll. Imagine living in a society where violence was a way of life, where raiding and warfare were considered honorable professions. Imagine witnessing death firsthand on a regular basis. Imagine the constant stress of providing for your family in a world where resources were scarce and competition was fierce. Music swells very slightly. We, in our modern world, are largely shielded from these realities. We live in relative safety and comfort, surrounded by conveniences and luxuries that would have been unimaginable to the Vikings. We have access to health care, education, and social support systems that provide a safety net in times of need. We are pampered. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, who wants to go back to living in a Viking village, right? But it's important to understand just how different life was back then, to appreciate the sacrifices that were made, the hardships that were endured, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. So, if you were suddenly transported back in time to a Viking fishing village, would you last a day? Honestly, probably not. You'd likely be overwhelmed by the smells, exhausted by the chores, terrified by the dangers, and completely unprepared for the sheer rawness of it all. You miss your comfortable bed, your hot shower, your readily available food, and your connection to the internet. You miss, well, everything. But maybe, just maybe, you'd also gain something. A newfound appreciation for the simple things in life, a deeper understanding of human resilience, a greater sense of connection to the natural world, and perhaps a little bit of perspective, because even though we wouldn't last a day in a Viking fishing village, there's still something to be learned from their way of life, something about the importance of community, the value of hard work, and the ability to adapt to even the most challenging circumstances. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the Vikings. Think about their struggles, their triumphs, and their questionable hygiene habits, and be grateful for the comfortable, safe, and relatively easy life that we live today. Sleep well, friends, and try not to dream of fish guts.